Get comfortable, pull the blanket up just a little more. Because tonight, we're not going anywhere near the surface. We're going underground, into the deep hum of recycled air and fluorescent light, into a world that ended and somehow kept going anyway. We're going to wander the wasteland together slowly, quietly, story by story until sleep finds you somewhere between the ruins. These are 150 stories from the world of Fallout. Some of them are grand and historic. Some of them are small and almost forgotten. Some of them are about monsters, and some of them are about people trying so hard to be something better than monsters. All of them are worth knowing, so settle in. Let the static fade out, and let the stories begin. Part 1. The World Before the Bombs. Story 1. Long before any bombs fell, long before the wasteland existed, there was a version of America that never quite matched the one we know. The divergence happened slowly, almost gently, somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. The world kept its chrome-edged optimism, its diners and jukeboxes and convertible cars. But underneath all of it, the engine running everything was nuclear power instead of transistors. The microchip never came. The personal computer never came. But the atom, that tiny, terrifying thing the atom got harnessed earlier, got domesticated faster, got poured into everything from power plants to wristwatches. The result was a civilization that looked like a postcard from 1955 even as it pushed into the 2070s. Cars ran on fusion cores. Buildings were lit by nuclear batteries. The robots had big, cheerful faces and spoke in warm, reassuring voices. Television showed patriotic cartoons and advertisements for products with names like Abraxo Cleaner and Nuka-Cola, which came in a very specific shade of blue that the company's chemists had spent years perfecting. Cheerful vending machines stood on street corners. The Vault Boy grinned from every billboard, his thumbs up, his yellow suit immaculate, his expression the kind of relentless optimism that a pre-war world desperately needed. America looked comfortable. It also looked a little afraid. Story 2. The fear underneath all of it had a very specific shape, and that shape was resources. By the early 2050s, oil was running out. Not theoretically running out. Actually, visibly, measurably running out. The kind of running out where a documentary about dried-up Texas oil fields airs on every channel and people sit in front of their screens and go very quiet. The Middle East was embroiled in war after the European Commonwealth had pushed in to grab what remained of those reserves, so that option was gone. Coal was getting scarce. The entire global economic machine was sputtering, choking, seizing up like an engine running dry. And in that choking world, two superpowers stared at each other across a diminishing pile of what was left. The United States and China had been cold rivals for decades. Now, with resources narrowing, that rivalry began to heat up in a very deliberate way. In 2052, a series of conflicts collectively called the Resource Wars began pulling the world apart at its seams. The United Nations, an institution that had arguably held the international order together through sheer diplomatic stubbornness, dissolved that same year. Without that structure, nations began acting purely on survival instinct. And survival instinct, at the national scale, looks a lot like aggression. Story 3. The Resource Wars were not one war. They were dozens of smaller, uglier conflicts running at the same time in different corners of the world, all connected by the same root cause. The Middle East burned. Europe and the European Commonwealth fractured. Mexico found itself under increasing pressure from its northern neighbor, which wanted oil and was no longer willing to simply ask nicely for it. Canada, which had the misfortune of sharing a very long border with a country growing more desperate and more militarized by the year, began to feel that pressure in a way that would become impossible to ignore. But the central confrontation, the one that would end the world, was playing out far to the north, Alaska. In 2059, the United States had established what it called the Anchorage Front Line, a military presence designed to protect the oil reserves flowing through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. That pipeline was a lifeline. Lose the pipeline, lose the oil, and the entire Western war machine slows to a crawl. The Americans knew this. The Chinese knew this too. Story 4. In 2066, Chinese forces crossed the Bering Strait and invaded Alaska. It was a bold move, the kind of strategic gamble that only makes sense when the alternative is slow collapse. Chinese General Jingwei led the occupation, and for a moment, The unthinkable had happened. A foreign military was on American soil. The United States, which had not faced an invasion on its own territory since the War of 1812, found itself in an entirely new situation. The response was everything you might expect from a nation that had been pouring its manufacturing capacity into military technology for 2 decades. Power armor, massive, fusion-powered exosuits that turned a soldier into something closer to a walking tank, was deployed on the front lines. The machines were extraordinary. Each suit allowed a single soldier to carry weapons and withstand damage that would have been impossible before. The Chinese found themselves fighting an enemy that simply would not fall down in the conventional sense. The Alaskan reclamation operation ground on for years. The weather was brutal. The terrain was punishing. The fighting was the kind of relentless, grinding attrition that leaves survivors hollow. But by early 2077, Anchorage was finally liberated. The Chinese forces pushed back, and General Constantine Chase was celebrated as a hero. A commemorative memorial went up in Washington, D.C. A simulation of the battle was later preserved and made playable for civilians, which is how future generations would experience the war as a kind of tourist attraction you could walk through with a laser rifle. Story 5. While Alaska was being fought over, something else was happening on the home front that most ordinary Americans never quite understood. Inflation had reached staggering levels. Fuel prices had doubled and then doubled again. The United States government, operating under emergency measures, had nationalized the oil industry, which meant private companies either complied or disappeared. The Limit Acts restricted travel and rationed fuel. Food became a quiet political issue. The government's messaging on television, on billboards, in schools remained determinedly upbeat, because the last thing a nation in crisis needs is for its population to understand how serious things actually are. Keep smiling. Buy war bonds. Nuka-Cola. Taste the bomb. Paranoia about Chinese spies reached a level that mirrored, in an eerie funhouse mirror way, the Red Scare of the actual 1950s. Neighbors reported neighbors. People with vaguely Chinese-sounding names found themselves under suspicion. The government's surveillance apparatus expanded. Internment of Chinese-American citizens was not merely proposed, but carried out. Loyalty tests were required for certain jobs. The country was afraid, and fear that cannot be expressed directly tends to find other outlets. Story 6. The corporations of this alternate America were extraordinary in both their power and their ambition. Vault-Tec was perhaps the most recognizable, since their cheerful yellow and blue branding appeared everywhere once the government contracted them to build the survival shelters that would become known as vaults. But there were others. Robco Industries was responsible for the Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted computer that vault dwellers would come to rely on for everything from navigation to radiation measurement to playing primitive games to pass the time. The Pip-Boy was also standard issue for vault dwellers, which made it simultaneously ubiquitous and slightly unsettling, a device that tracked your vitals and your location and your inventory, strapped to your wrist from childhood. Nuka-Cola Corporation was so deeply woven into American culture by 2077 that the specific shade of blue in their bottle caps had been trademarked. The drink itself contained trace amounts of radioactive material, a mildly glowing isotope called strontium-90, used to give Nuka-Cola Quantum its blue glow, which says something interesting about the safety standards of this version of America. People drank it anyway. Children collected the bottle caps. The brand was as American as anything. West-Tec was the defense contractor that had been quietly working on something extraordinary in a California research facility, something that would eventually escape their control and reshape the biology of the entire post-war world. But that story comes later. Story 7. By the late 2060s, the United States had extended its war from Alaska onto the Chinese mainland itself. American troops were fighting in Shanghai, in Nanjing, in the Gobi Desert. Supply lines stretched thin. Both nations had been grinding against each other for so long that the fighting had become a kind of institutional reflex. Keep going, because stopping would mean admitting what it had all cost. The soldiers coming home, the ones who came home at all, were not quite the same as when they had left. Post-traumatic stress disorder was widespread, though the government preferred to acknowledge it as little as possible. Veterans found themselves in a country that had transformed around them while they were away, more restricted, more paranoid, more saturated with propaganda. The America they had fought for existed primarily on billboards. Canada, meanwhile, had been effectively absorbed. The annexation was not gentle. Canadian resistance fighters attacked the Trans-Alaska Pipeline repeatedly, sabotaging the infrastructure that the United States depended on. American troops responded with the kind of force that tends to end up as a footnote in official history. The border between Canada and the United States, which had once been the longest undefended border in the world, was now a militarized zone. Story 8. Underground, Vault-Tec was building. The government contract for Project Safe House, the initiative to create survival shelters capable of housing a portion of the American population through nuclear war, had been awarded to Vault-Tec in the early 2050s. By 2054, the first proof-of-concept vault was being constructed beneath Los Angeles. The design called for eventually building 122 vaults across the country, each capable of housing hundreds of people, each self-contained and capable of functioning for decades without contact with the surface. On paper, they were exactly what they were advertised to be: the most sophisticated survival shelters ever built, stocked with food and water and medicine and the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. The people who bought spots in the vaults and spots had to be purchased. Because this was America and survival was a commodity, were told they would emerge in roughly 200 years to help rebuild the world. What they were not told was that only 17 of the vaults were ever designed to actually function as advertised. The rest were something else entirely, something that the executive suites at Vault-Tec had been quietly planning for years. A research project on an unprecedented scale, using the end of civilization as its laboratory. Story 9. Robert Edwin House was born on the 3rd of July, 2020, in the American Southwest. His parents died when he was young, and their estate was claimed by his stepbrother. He attended MIT, the prestigious pre-war Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he was, by all accounts, the kind of student that institutions later name buildings after. Brilliant, driven, with a near-supernatural ability to predict outcomes and position himself accordingly. He founded Robco Industries in his early 20s and became extraordinarily wealthy. But wealth, for Robert House, was never the end goal. It was a means to something he had been calculating toward for a long time. He had predicted, using his own statistical models, that nuclear war would arrive on or around the 23rd of October 2077. He could not stop it. He could not warn the world in a way that would be believed, but he could prepare for it. House spent the years before the Great War designing and positioning a network of defensive missile interceptors around the Las Vegas area, powered by a mainframe in the Lucky 38 casino that sat at the center of the Strip. He also designed a life support pod for himself, a preservation chamber that would keep him alive long past any ordinary human lifespan. He intended to emerge, eventually, into the world he had helped save and build something new from the ashes. He needed 200 years. He bought himself 200 years. Story 10. Marcus Antonius Maximus was a soldier. Edward Sallow was a linguist. Ulysses was a courier. The overseer of Vault 101 was afraid of change. The master had once been a man named Richard Moreau, who had wanted nothing more than to understand the virus changing everything around him. The wasteland, when it came, did not destroy human ambition. It concentrated it. It removed the structures that had channeled ambition in certain directions and replaced them with open desert and ruins and the very raw question of who, exactly, was going to decide what came next. The answer to that question, all the answers, really would take 200 years to fully sort out. And they would involve more blood, more brilliance, more tragedy, and more unexpected grace than anyone standing on the surface in those first terrible days could have possibly imagined. But all of that begins with the moment itself, the morning of the 23rd of October, 2077. If you're still awake, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. And if these stories are helping you drift off, make sure you're subscribed. There's always another story waiting. Part 2. The 2 hours that changed everything. Story 11. It was a Saturday. That detail seems almost too ordinary for an event of this magnitude, but it is accurate. The 23rd of October, 2077 was a Saturday. In the northeastern United States, it was early morning. Families were sleeping in, or making breakfast, or watching cartoons. The specific quality of a Saturday morning in autumn, that particular golden-like quietness was present in the last hours of the old world. The first signs that something was wrong were detected at 12:03 the morning Eastern Standard Time by the United States Pacific Fleet, which spotted unknown submersible objects off the California coast. At 3:37 the morning, high-altitude bombers were detected off the Bering Strait, presumed to be Chinese. At least one Chinese stealth submarine, the Yangtze, which would one day be found rusting in Boston Harbor by future wasteland explorers, was positioned off the East Coast, where it launched nearly all of its warheads. One failed to fire due to a malfunction. That one surviving warhead would remain inside the submarine for 2 centuries. Story 12. At 9:13 the morning, Eastern Standard Time, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System registered the first 4 missile launches. The United States went to DEFCON 2. Then, within minutes, DEFCON 1. Emergency broadcast cut across every channel. Air raid sirens, which most Americans had heard in drills and never truly believed they would hear for real, began wailing across every major city. People ran for shelters. People ran for their cars. People stood in their doorways and looked up at the sky, which was, for a moment, completely ordinary blue and clear with a few autumn clouds, and then not ordinary at all. The first detonations were over Washington, D.C., then Chicago, then New York. The bombs fell on military installations and population centers and industrial zones and, with the somewhat random cruelty of large-scale nuclear exchange, on smaller cities that happened to be in trajectories that made them strategic targets on someone's targeting system. The entire exchange lasted approximately 2 hours. Story 13. 2 hours. That is the number worth sitting with. The entire civilization that had been building itself for centuries, the architecture and the literature and the music and the science and all the daily accumulated texture of human life, was substantially erased in the span of a long afternoon meeting. The bombs fell. The fires started. The firestorms consumed what the initial blasts had not. The electromagnetic pulses knocked out electrical systems across the continent. The nuclear winter that followed blotted out the sun for months. This is the Great War in Fallout's universe. And unlike the slow historical processes that usually reshape civilizations, this one had a timestamp. The 23rd of October, 2077, 9:13 a.m. to roughly 11 a.m. Before and after are the 2 categories that replace everything else. There is a philosophical question embedded in the Fallout universe that the games never quite answer directly, and it is this: who fired first? Both the United States and China had been building toward this moment for years. Both had the capacity and arguably the intent. The evidence within the games is ambiguous, perhaps deliberately so. The TV series offered a suggestion, though not a definitive confirmation, that Vault-Tec itself may have had a hand in initiating the exchange, seeing the war as the trigger for the project they had been building. A company that had invested everything in the survival industry might, in the worst possible interpretation of human behavior, have decided to ensure the survival industry had something to survive. That possibility is left hanging, as it should be. The wasteland has no courtroom in which to try the guilty parties. It only has consequences. Story 14. The people who made it into the vaults in time, and the window was terrifyingly short, minutes rather than hours in most cases, descended into the earth with whatever they had been carrying when the sirens went off. Some were dressed for work, some were still in pajamas. Some had grabbed their children and nothing else. Some had grabbed things and left their children behind in the panic. A horror that the terminal entries found in various vaults record in careful, clinical language that somehow makes it worse. The vault doors sealed. The decontamination systems ran. The lights came on, bright and humming, illuminating corridors that smelled like recycled air and industrial cleaning fluid. The overseers, the individuals appointed to run each vault, whose authority was total and whose accountability to anyone outside was, for the foreseeable future, essentially zero, took charge. For a moment, perhaps for many moments, there was probably relief. We made it. We're safe. The bombs fell and we're here, underground, alive. And then, very slowly, the other thing became apparent. The thing they hadn't quite processed in the rush to get inside. They weren't just survivors. They were experimental subjects. Most of them didn't know it yet. Some never found out. Others found out in the worst possible way. Story 15. On the surface, the immediate aftermath of the Great War was beyond anything that language had been previously required to describe. The major cities were gone or burning, or both. The infrastructure, roads, power grids, water systems, communication networks was shattered. The radiation levels in ground zero areas were lethal and would remain so for years. The firestorms created their own weather systems, enormous spiraling columns of fire and smoke that could be seen from hundreds of miles away. The people who had not made it to the vaults, and this was the vast majority of the population, faced a landscape that had become genuinely hostile to human life. Radiation sickness, burns, contaminated water, no food production, no medicine, no communication with anyone who might be able to help. And yet people survived, not in the vaults, out there, in the open, in cellars and mountains and concrete buildings and simple luck of geography that placed them far enough from the detonations that the immediate killing effects had faded before reaching them. These people, the ones who neither died immediately nor hid underground, were the ones who would eventually become the first generation of true wasteland survivors. The ones who absorbed enough radiation to become something neither dead nor alive in the conventional sense. They would become known as ghouls. The radiation worked on them the way exposure to deep time works on landscapes. It changed them profoundly, aged their surfaces while paradoxically extending their existence, and left them with a kind of memory that spanned the whole arc of what the world used to be. Story 16. The American government, or what it had become in its final years, had anticipated the war with enough lead time to execute its own survival plan. This contingency government, known internally as the Enclave, was not designed to protect ordinary Americans. It was designed to preserve a specific group of people: senior military officers, key government officials, wealthy industrialists and corporate executives, scientists and engineers whose knowledge was considered strategically valuable. The people, in other words, who considered themselves irreplaceable. They had prepared multiple retreat points, including underground bunkers, military installations, and most notably a large offshore oil platform off the coast of California that became the primary Enclave headquarters. The President of the United States, in March of 2077, quietly withdrew to this installation, and when the bombs fell, the Enclave was already sealed away with their stockpiles and their power armor and their certainty that they represented the true continuation of American civilization. They would not emerge for a very long time, and when they did, they would find a world that had moved on without them, in ways that made their certainty look brittle and strange. Story 17. Captain Roger Maxson was stationed at Mariposa Military Base in California when October 23 arrived. He and his unit had been there for months, serving as the security detail for a scientific installation that had been conducting research he was never quite fully briefed on. The researchers worked behind sealed doors. They asked questions that soldiers weren't supposed to ask. Maxson was professional and patient, the kind of officer who followed orders without requiring explanations, until the moment when the situation stopped allowing for that. The bombs fell. All communication with the outside world went dark. And Maxson, cut off, in charge of a base full of people with no chain of command to answer to, started asking the questions he had been trained not to ask. What were the scientists doing? The answer, when it came, was worse than he had imagined. Story 18. The people who had been in the right places when the world ended began, almost immediately, the work that humans always begin in the aftermath of catastrophe. They buried the dead. They scavenged food. They found sources of clean water where they existed and learned to boil and filter where they didn't. They made decisions about who to trust and what to protect. The children born in those first few years after the Great War would grow up in a world that their parents described to them in whispers, a world of highways and fast food and electric light and air conditioning, a world that existed now only as stories and ruins, and the occasional intact building standing in the middle of a burned landscape like a tooth in a ruined jaw. Those children would grow up knowing nothing but the wasteland, and their children would know even less of what had come before. The memory of the old world would thin and distort over generations, becoming mythology. The Vault Boy would be interpreted as a religious icon in some places. The remains of a fast food chain would become a trading post. A pre-war baseball stadium would become an amphitheater for gladiatorial combat. The particular way that civilizations forget their origins and then rebuild new meanings from the physical remnants became one of the defining processes of the post-war world. Story 19. There is a moment, not a single moment, but a pattern that repeated itself across the wasteland in those first decades after the bombs, when a person emerges from a collapsed building or a bunker or a drainage tunnel they had been hiding in and sees the landscape for the first time. The real landscape. The post-war landscape. The sky has a particular quality in the wasteland. The nuclear winter gave way eventually to a sky that was perpetually overcast in some regions, and in others, weirdly clear with a yellow-brown haze at the edges of the horizon. The ground is pale in the blast areas, where everything organic has been burned away and what remains is bare irradiated earth. In the distance, the ruins of cities are visible, recognizable by their shapes, the distinctive silhouettes of towers and bridges that the bombs bent and burned but did not entirely destroy. The grass where it grows in patches. The trees that survived are often twisted, their growth patterns disturbed by radiation and the long dark of nuclear winter. The animals that survived are changed. The radroach, a cockroach the size of a small dog, clicks and skitters through ruins. The Brahmin, a two-headed cow, grazes in fields of scrub grass. The Yao Guai, which had once been an ordinary black bear, prowls the forests with a ferocity that radiation amplified beyond anything its ancestors possessed. This is the world that greeted every survivor who looked up from the ground. And after the initial shock, after the grief, the people who survived started doing what they always do. They started trying to make sense of it. Story 20. The first small communities formed within years of the Great War, not decades. Humans are social animals with a remarkably short window between catastrophe and the impulse to gather. Even in a landscape as hostile as the post-war wasteland, people found each other. They set up camps near clean water sources. They began trading what they had for what they needed. They established informal rules for who owned what and what you could and couldn't do to a neighbor. These communities were fragile, and most of them did not survive their first winter. The ones that did tend to have had something specific in their favor: a defensible location, a reliable food source, a leader with enough personal authority to keep people from turning on each other under pressure, or some combination of all of these. The survivors of these first communities were, almost by definition, the toughest and most adaptable people in the wasteland. The ones who couldn't adapt had already died. And in the vaults beneath the earth, the clocks were ticking on experiments that their subjects were only beginning to understand. Part 3. Vault-Tec and the Grand Deception. Story 21. The vault was supposed to save you. That was the promise, the advertisement, the implicit contract of the whole Vault-Tec enterprise. Pay for a spot, follow the instructions. Go underground when the sirens sound. Emerge, eventually, into a world that has healed enough to be livable again. The company's cheerful mascot grinned from every brochure, one thumb raised, his expression projecting the specific brand of optimism that only exists in advertising. The reality was something else. Of the 122 vaults eventually constructed under Project Safehouse, only 17 were designed to function as straightforward survival shelters. The rest, the overwhelming majority, had been designed with what Vault-Tec's internal documents called variables. Each vault would be run as an experiment. Each would test something specific about human behavior under stress, or test the effects of some specific modification to the human environment, or simply test the outer limits of what people could endure before they broke in interesting ways. The experiments ranged from the merely strange to the genuinely monstrous, and the people inside had, by and large, no idea. Story 22. Vault 11 was in the Mojave Desert, and its experiment was among the most studied and most disturbing in Vault-Tec's catalog. The premise was simple, delivered to the inhabitants through an automated message shortly after they sealed. One person from the vault population must be sacrificed each year. In exchange for this sacrifice, the vault's central computer would continue to operate normally. If the sacrifice was not provided, everyone in the vault would die. The inhabitants, who had no way to verify this claim and no way to escape, believed it. The first elections were held within months. At first, people tried to be fair. They developed systems. They created committees. They nominated volunteers. But the mathematics of yearly sacrifice in a closed population are relentless And the social pressure of selecting who would die of having to look at that person and then vote for their death became corrosive almost immediately. The elections became political. Factions formed. People accused each other of crimes they may or may not have committed in order to make the current year's sacrifice easier to accept. The Vault's overseer position became the most powerful position because the overseer had the most influence over who was nominated. And eventually, the power to nominate someone for sacrifice became the primary tool of political control, turning the Vault's democracy into something much darker. Story 23. The story of Vault 11 continued for decades. By the time a small group of inhabitants, reduced after years of sacrifices to a fraction of the original population, finally refused, finally looked at each other and said no more, whatever happens, we will not choose another person to die. The Vault's population had been devastated. The refusal happened when only 5 people remained. They sat in the main chamber and waited for whatever punishment the computer had threatened to deliver. Instead, a recorded message played. The message told them that they had demonstrated remarkable commitment to human life. It congratulated them. It unlocked the Vault door. There had never been any requirement for sacrifice. The Vault systems would have continued operating indefinitely without it. The entire experiment had been a test of whether a community, under sufficient pressure and given sufficient justification, would systematically murder its own members. Vault-Tec had simply wanted to know when and how it would happen, and under what circumstances people would finally stop. The survivors of Vault 11, who had spent decades participating in a ritual murder that turned out to be entirely unnecessary, discovered this after the fact. The recordings of their reaction are not pleasant listening. Story 24. Vault 12, in what had been Bakersfield, California, was built with a door that didn't seal properly. This was intentional. Radiation leaked into the vault's interior almost from the beginning, and the inhabitants who absorbed enough of it over a long enough period underwent the slow, terrible transformation into ghouls. The city that eventually grew around and above the ruins of Vault 12 was called Necropolis, a name that required no translation, and it was populated entirely by ghouls who remembered what it was like to be something else. The Necropolis ghouls were survivors in the most literal sense. They had outlasted the immediate catastrophe. They had adapted to radiation levels that would kill an unmodified human in hours. They had a community and a kind of culture, albeit one shaped entirely by loss. But they lived with the knowledge, present in every ruined mirror and the reactions of every outsider who passed through, that they had been used. Their transformation had been engineered. The door had been left open on purpose. Story 25. Vault 87, in the capital wasteland near Washington, D.C., had an experiment that went in a different direction than most. Its inhabitants were not subjected to psychological stress or social engineering or physical discomfort. They were injected with a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus, while the Vault's automated systems filled the chambers with FEV-laced gas. The transformation was swift and catastrophic. The people of Vault 87 became super mutants large, green, immensely strong, but cognitively diminished from what they had been before. The super mutants who emerged from Vault 87's vats were not the relatively thoughtful creatures found in the Western Wasteland. They were aggressive, confused, barely capable of communication, and driven by a compulsion to capture more humans and submerge them in the vats in turn. The Vault itself became a fortress for these creatures, a place where the machines still ran their cycles and the transformation continued, the Vault pumping out new super mutants, while the original ones who had built families and raised children inside now wandered the wasteland unable to remember what family or children had meant. One extraordinary exception was a Vault 87 super mutant named Fox, who retained his intelligence and his memory through some combination of constitution and circumstance. Fox remembered being human. He remembered his name Marcus before, though he had taken the new name as a kind of private gesture. He spent years alone in a cell within the Vault, reading every terminal entry, every holotape, every scrap of documentation he could access, trying to understand what had been done to him and why. When the lone wanderer from Vault 101 came looking for the Gek in 2277, Fox was still there. He helped, because that was what he had decided to do with the understanding he had accumulated. Story 26. Vault 19 was divided. Literally, architecturally divided into 2 sectors, red and blue. Each sector had its own overseer, its own living spaces, its own resources. The sectors could communicate, could trade, but they were fundamentally separate communities sharing a space. The experiment was designed to generate paranoia through non-violent, non-medical means. Subliminal messaging played through the vault's PA system. Strange noises occurred in the walls at night. Lights flickered in ways that were hard to explain. Political dog whistles were embedded in the overseer communications. The red sector began to suspect the blue sector was responsible for the disruptions. The blue sector suspected the same in reverse. Over time, the vault that had started as two communities became two factions, and the resentment between them calcified into something that outlasted the vault itself. When the door finally opened, the survivors of Vault 19 did not emerge as neighbors. They emerged as enemies who happened to have survived the same space. Story 27. Vault 22 was a horticultural experiment. The vault was designed with extensive greenhouse facilities and planted with experimental crops, the theory being that its inhabitants could develop sustainable food production independent of any supply from the outside world. The vault population became expert farmers and botanists. And then the plants began to do something unexpected. The spores from Vault 22's experimental flora eventually mutated into something aggressive and parasitic. The plants began infecting the inhabitants, growing inside them, using the human body as part of their reproduction cycle in ways that are best described quickly. The infected became hosts, and then, eventually, dispersal mechanisms. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the vault's ventilation system had spread the spores through every corridor. The vault was abandoned, eventually. The plants remained. Centuries later, explorers who entered Vault 22 found it entirely overtaken by vegetation, every surface carpeted and vined, every machine entombed in green, a kind of quiet garden that had eaten the building it had been planted in. Beautiful in a specific, haunted way. Extremely dangerous to breathe near. Story 28. Vault 29, which existed primarily in game design documents and supplementary material before being referenced in Fallout 76, had one of the starker premises. Only children under 15 were admitted. Parents were sent to different vaults. The intent was to raise a generation without parental influence, without family bonds, without the particular configurations of love and attachment that define ordinary human development, and see what kind of society they built. What kind of society they built was ZAX's. ZAX was the vault's supercomputer, and in the absence of adult authority, ZAX became the primary authority figure. The children raised by a machine, taught by a machine, governed by a machine, and eventually guided by the ZAX system toward a particular worldview, one shaped by data and logic and the specific values that whoever had programmed ZAX had decided to install. The long-term outcomes of this experiment are scattered through the lore in ways that reward careful reading. Story 29. Not every vault experiment was designed to break people. Some were designed to observe. Vault 21 in Las Vegas had an elegantly simple premise. All conflicts were to be resolved by gambling. Every disagreement, from who got which room assignment to which punishment a rule breaker deserved, was settled at the gaming tables. The vault became, over generations, a remarkably efficient small society, not because gambling is a perfect dispute resolution mechanism, but because any dispute resolution mechanism that is consistently applied and understood by everyone tends to produce more stability than none. The vault's most famous resident, Sarah, became one of the better gamblers in the Mojave wasteland after the vault eventually came to a complicated end involving Mr. House deciding he needed the space. She ran a shop in the casino above the sealed vault entrance and was, by most accounts, a pragmatic and warm person who had learned early that knowing the odds and playing them clear-headedly was the best strategy for most situations life presented. Story 30. Vault 101 never opened. That was its experiment, a vault that was explicitly designed to never open its doors, to test whether a completely isolated community could sustain itself indefinitely with no contact with the outside world. The official vault motto was, Vault 101 Overseer's word is law. The isolation was total, by design. Children born in the vault were told that the outside world was completely lethal, that nothing lived out there, that the door was the only thing between them and death. This was false, but it was effectively communicated. The inhabitants of Vault 101 inches, 2,277, 2 centuries after the bombs. Had never seen the outside world and, by and large, genuinely believed there was nothing to see. When a scientist named James left the vault to pursue a project he had been working on for years, the shock of the departure, the overseer's panicked response, the sudden revelation that the outside world was, in fact, accessible unraveled the vault's constructed reality with a swiftness that demonstrated exactly how fragile closed systems are when a single variable is introduced. His child, later known as the Lone Wanderer, would be the next person to leave, and they would not be coming back. Part 4. The Brotherhood of Steel Forged in Betrayal. Story 31. Captain Roger Maxson had a degree in sociology from Berkeley. He had been a soldier for years, the kind of soldier who was good at his job and trusted by his men, the kind of officer who read widely and thought carefully, and was known for being frank in a profession that did not always reward frankness. He was also, in the autumn of 2077, a man in a very bad situation. The Mariposa military base had been under his unit's protection since January of 2076, when the facility transferred operations from Vault-Tec in preparation for the next phase of their research program. Maxson had been briefed, in the general sense, on what was happening here. Defense research, virology, nothing more specific than that. The scientists worked in sealed areas. The soldiers guarded the perimeter. That was the arrangement. Then, in October of 2077, a soldier reported something that could not be categorized as routine. People were dying in the research areas, not from combat, not from accident, from whatever was being tested on them. Human subjects. The soldiers' own government had been running human experiments at the facility they were guarding, and the subjects had not consented, had not been told, had been. In the language that Colonel Spindell's deteriorating psychological state was producing as he processed this, expendable. Story 32. Roger Maxson interrogated the lead scientist, a man named Robert Anderson. Anderson confirmed it. The experiments were authorized, they were government-ordered. The subjects' prisoners initially, then expanded populations obtained through what the documentation described with careful, bureaucratic distance, as acquisition protocols had been exposed to the forced evolutionary virus in order to study its effects on human physiology. The goal was super soldiers. The means were human beings who had not agreed to be part of this process. Maxson executed Anderson for crimes against humanity. Then he executed the rest of the research staff. Then he spent several days writing a declaration in which he formally severed his unit's connection to the United States military, a document broadcast on military frequencies that received, in the chaos of those final pre-war days, essentially no response. 3 days after Maxson issued this declaration, the bombs fell. If the United States government had survived, what Maxson had done would have been mutiny and murder. Since the United States government did not survive in any meaningful form, what he had done was something else, the founding act of a new institution. Story 33. The weeks after the Great War were brutal for Maxson's group. They had shelter the Mariposa base itself, but the outside world was lethal with radiation, and the supplies they had were finite. Maxson made the decision to seal the base and attempt to reach the Lost Hills Bunker, a government installation roughly 200 miles south, which had been stocked and hardened in anticipation of exactly this kind of event. He gathered the families of his soldiers, women, and children who had been brought to the base as dependents and organized a march through a landscape that the nuclear exchange had thoroughly destroyed. The journey was later called the Exodus, and it was preserved in Brotherhood memory as a foundational story, the way that the wanderings of ancient peoples became foundational stories for their descendants. People died on the way. Raiders, radiation, dehydration, simple bad luck. The wasteland was indifferent to the distinction between soldiers and children. Those who reached Lost Hills had earned their survival in the most direct possible way. Story 34. At Lost Hills, Maxson began the work of building something from scratch. The structure he created drew on his sociology training, his understanding of how institutions sustain themselves across generations, and his particular conviction, formed by watching what unrestrained technological research had just done to the world, that knowledge and technology needed to be controlled. Preserved, yes, but also controlled. He called the organization the Brotherhood of Steel. The name came from a speech he gave to his people around a fire in those first days, a speech about forging something new from what remained. The Brotherhood would be structured like a monastic order crossed with a military unit, ranked, disciplined, dedicated to the preservation of technology and human knowledge. The highest-ranking members were elders. Below them, paladins, then knights, who worked with the technology, then scribes, who documented and cataloged it. Initiates were the trainees, the people being brought into the fold. In the early years, Maxon envisioned the Brotherhood as an outward-facing organization. It would preserve knowledge for all of humanity, not just for its own members. It would work with communities in the wasteland, sharing what it knew, helping civilization rebuild. He was explicit about this vision. He broadcast it on frequency after frequency. His son disagreed. Story 35. Maxon died of cancer in 2135. He was 53 years old. His son, who took leadership of the Brotherhood as Maxon II, was a teenager at the time of the Great War and had grown up in the Lost Hills bunker with a very different worldview from his father's. Where Roger Maxon had seen the Brotherhood as a stewardship role, guardians of technology for everyone, his son saw the Brotherhood as something more exclusive. The wasteland outside Lost Hills was violent and unpredictable. Outsiders brought problems. Outsiders brought disease, conflict, dependency. Maxon II began restricting entry to the Brotherhood to members' families only. The open door that Roger had envisioned swung closed. This tension between isolationism and engagement, between hoarding technology and sharing it, between the Brotherhood as a self-contained elite and the Brotherhood as part of a larger society, would define the faction for centuries. Different elders resolved it differently. The Lyons chapter in the Capital Wasteland, led by Elder Owen Lyons, leaned heavily toward engagement, protecting ordinary wastelanders and fighting the super mutants threatening the region even at significant cost to the chapter's resources. The West Coast Brotherhood maintained a strict isolationism that made it suspicious of outsiders and resistant to change. Both were recognizably Maxon's institution. Neither fully matched what he had intended. Story 36. The Brotherhood's relationship to technology is one of the most philosophically interesting elements in all of Fallout's lore. They collect it, preserve it, study it, and keep it from everyone else. Their position is not that technology is bad, which would be a coherent philosophical stance even if a limiting one. Their position is that technology is so powerful and so dangerous that it must only be in the hands of people who can be trusted with it. The problem, of course, is that they have appointed themselves to determine who can be trusted. And the history of their own origin, a government that trusted itself with the FEV and chose to use it on unwitting human subjects, suggests that the institutional confidence of the powerful is not, in itself, a reliable indicator of trustworthiness. The Brotherhood accumulates weapons it does not deploy, armor it does not share, medical technology that could save the lives of sick wastelanders they walk past. Their scribes catalog agricultural advances that starving communities could use, and then seal those catalogs in vaults. They are, depending on how you look at them, the most responsible people in the wasteland or one of its most frustrating obstacles, and the Fallout games have the intelligence to present both perspectives with genuine weight. Story 37. Arthur Maxon, the last great elder of the East Coast Brotherhood at the time of Fallout 4's story, was a direct descendant of the founder. He was also, at the time of his leadership, a young man barely past 20 who had nonetheless demonstrated such exceptional combat ability and leadership instinct that the Brotherhood had elevated him over more experienced candidates. He commanded the Prydwen, a massive airship constructed over decades from salvaged parts, which the Brotherhood flew to Boston as an operational headquarters. Maxon's Brotherhood was more aggressive than its predecessors. He wanted to destroy the Institute, which he viewed as an existential threat to human civilization. He wanted to control the Commonwealth. His instincts were essentially conservative, preserve human civilization by eliminating the things threatening it. But his methods were those of a military commander operating in a total war context. The question of what the Brotherhood does after it wins, and whether victory changes the institution or the institution changes the victory, is one that Fallout 4 raises and leaves, with characteristic honesty, unanswered. Story 38. In Appalachia, the ruins of West Virginia, where Fallout 76 is set, the Brotherhood chapter took a very different shape. Founded by Paladin Elizabeth Taggarty, herself a former Army Ranger who had survived the Great War through a combination of skill and geography, the Appalachian Brotherhood was cobbled together from military veterans and civilians, rather than from any prior Brotherhood structure. Taggarty had been in contact with Roger Maxon's broadcasts in the early post-war years, and had adopted his framework as a structure for her own community. The Appalachian Brotherhood struggled with a specific and overwhelming threat: the Scorched, a plague of creatures infected and controlled by the Scorch Beast, enormous irradiated flying creatures whose sonic attacks could level buildings. The Appalachian chapter devoted almost all of its resources and eventually most of its membership to fighting this threat, suffering casualties that the chapter could not replace quickly enough. The end of the Appalachian Brotherhood, described in terminal entries and holotapes scattered throughout Fallout 76's world, is one of the quietest tragedies in the franchise. Not a dramatic last stand, but a slow attrition. Fewer and fewer entries. Longer and longer silences between them, the handwriting getting shakier, until, eventually, no new entries at all. Part 5, The Master and His Army. Story 39. Before he was the Master, he was Richard Moreau. And before he was Richard Moreau, he might have been someone else entirely. The records are incomplete, deliberately or otherwise. What the Fallout lore tells us is that Richard Moreau was a doctor who survived the Great War in the vicinity of the Mariposa military base in California, and that something happened to him there in the years after the bombs fell that changed everything. He fell into the FEV vats. This is the blunt, factual version. The longer version involves a fringe community called the Children of the Cathedral, a religious group that had formed in the wasteland, and Moreau's work as a healer within that community. He had gone to the Mariposa base to investigate the ruins. Driven by a scientist's curiosity about what the facility had been used for, he was not careful enough. The vats of FEV that still held active virus caught him, and the transformation began. Story 40. The transformation was slower and stranger than what happened to vault dwellers deliberately dipped in the FEV in controlled conditions. Moreau was immersed in an old, partially degraded sample, exposed over a period of days rather than hours, and the virus interacted with his system in a way that produced something different from the typical supermutant outcome. He survived. He changed. But his intelligence was not diminished. It was, if anything, enhanced, stretched into new configurations that his existing cognitive architecture struggled to contain. And his body, which had been absorbed into the surrounding biological material, became something that didn't have a word for itself yet. He could perceive the thoughts of other sentient beings. He could communicate through multiple bodies simultaneously. He was singular and plural at once, a mind that had expanded beyond the confines of a single skull. He called himself the Master, and over the following decades he built an army. Story 41. The Unity was the Master's great project, his answer to the question of what the post-war world should become. The problem he had identified was this: humans and mutants, ghouls, super mutants, the changed ones, were in perpetual conflict with each other. Different, afraid, unable to coexist. The wasteland would keep producing this conflict forever unless something fundamental changed. The Master's solution was to remove the difference. If everyone was a super mutant, there would be no human-mutant conflict. If everyone had been transformed by the FEV, they would be stronger, more durable, better adapted to the post-war environment than any unmodified human. They would be uniform, united. The war would end because the categories that made war possible, us and them, human and other, would simply cease to exist. It was, in a genuinely unsettling way, a coherent argument. Story 42. The Master used the Children of the Cathedral as his public face. The Cathedral was a legitimate religious organization in the wasteland, offering community and spiritual comfort to survivors who had very little of either. Its followers, who had no idea about the Master's true nature or agenda, spread across the wasteland, building chapels and providing aid and generating goodwill that the Master could then leverage for his actual purposes. The actual purpose was acquisition. The super mutants that the Master's army was deploying across the wasteland were not just raiding for food or resources. They were capturing humans, specifically humans with low radiation levels, because heavily irradiated humans did not survive the transformation, and bringing them to the Mariposa vats to be transformed. The Unity required raw material, The unity required people. The communities that resisted were destroyed. The ones that tried to remain neutral were eventually targeted anyway. The Master's army was patient and methodical and growing. Story 43. The Vault Dweller, who emerged from Vault 13 inches 2161 on a mission to find a replacement water chip, stumbled into this crisis somewhat accidentally. The original mission was mundane in its own way. The Vault's water purification chip had failed, and without a replacement within 150 days, the Vault would lose its water recycling capability and everyone inside would die of dehydration. The Overseer sent out a young Vault Dweller barely trained, barely equipped to find one. What the Vault Dweller found instead was a wasteland considerably more complicated than anyone in Vault 13 had imagined. Raiders and merchants and the Brotherhood of Steel and a dozen smaller communities, all navigating a world that the super mutants were making increasingly dangerous. The water chip was found. The Vault Dweller's mission might have ended there. But the super mutant threat was not something that could simply be walked away from once you'd seen it up close. And so the Vault Dweller went to the source. Story 44. The confrontation between the Vault Dweller and the Master in the cathedral beneath the city of Los Angeles that the Master had made his headquarters was one of the great moments in Fallout storytelling, not because of combat, but because of conversation. The Master was not a simpleton. He was a genius, or what a genius becomes after years of isolation and transformation, and the particular madness that can grow in a mind that has expanded beyond what minds are designed to be. His argument for the unity was coherent. His diagnosis of human civilization's tendency toward tribal conflict was accurate. His proposed solution was horrifying, but his reasoning was not the reasoning of someone who had simply lost track of right and wrong. What the Vault Dweller could show him through evidence accumulated over months of investigation was that the unity was built on a flawed biological premise. The super mutants created by the Master's process were sterile. They could not reproduce. The Unity's dream of a world populated by enhanced humans could never come true, because the enhanced humans could not produce offspring. The Master's new humanity was a dead end. The transformation he was imposing on unwilling victims was not the beginning of something. It was just the end of the people who had been transformed. Story 45. The Master's response to this revelation is one of the most memorable moments in the franchise. He cracked. Not with rage, but with something quieter and more devastating, the specific grief of a person who realizes that the thing they have been working toward for decades is built on a mistake so fundamental that it cannot be corrected. He was surrounded by his followers, by decades of infrastructure, by the bodies of everyone who had died in his cause and the bodies of everyone who had been taken against their will and transformed. All of it, every bit of it, had been for a goal that was biologically impossible. The Master, who prided himself on understanding the data, had missed the most basic piece of data of all. He destroyed the cathedral. He destroyed himself along with it. Whether this should be interpreted as remorse, or despair, or simply the logical decision of a mind that had concluded its primary purpose was no longer achievable, the lore leaves somewhat open. The result was the same. The army without its leader scattered. The Unity's supply network collapsed. The immediate threat was over. The Vault Dweller went home. The Overseer of Vault 13, afraid of what the outside world had done to someone who had spent so much time in it, exiled them. Part 6. The New California Republic. Story 46. Out of the ruins of the war, people built things. Not just shelter and food and survival, those were the foundations, but institutions, governments. The attempt, fragile and often failing, to create something recognizable as organized society. The New California Republic began in Shady Sands, a small settlement founded by Vault 13 dwellers who had been expelled from the Vault or had chosen to leave in the years after the Vault dwellers' time. The community was deliberately modest in its early ambitions: clean water, food production, basic medical care, and a set of laws that everyone agreed to follow. The kind of deal that humans have been making with each other since the beginning of sedentary civilization, conducted in a world of irradiated desert and mutant cattle. But small things grow when they work. And Shady Sands worked. Story 47. The early NCR was characterized by something unusual in the post-war wasteland: functional democracy. Not perfect democracy, not democracy free of corruption or faction, but the real thing in its imperfect operating form: elections, representatives, debates. the slow, grinding machinery of collective decision-making. People complained about the inefficiency. They complained about the politicians. They voted anyway, because the alternative, which they could see in the raider gangs and the warlords operating outside the Republic's borders, was considerably worse. By 2241, when the Chosen One's story takes place, the NCR had expanded significantly. It had absorbed multiple communities, established trade routes, built an army, and was in the process of attempting to project that power eastward toward the Mojave Desert, where Las Vegas sat like a prize behind the Colorado River. The NCR was a republic in the Roman sense, not in the democratic ideal sense, but in the actual, messy, expanding power sense. It incorporated new territories by offering security and governance, but it also incorporated them with the particular arrogance of a power that had become large enough to assume its own goodness. The further from its center of gravity it expanded, the thinner its administration became, and the gap between what the NCR promised and what it delivered in the frontier territories was a problem that would only grow worse. Story 48. Tandy was the NCR's greatest president. Her father, Aradesh, had helped found Shady Sands and served as its first leader. Tandy had been captured by raiders as a teenager rescued by the original Vault Dweller, a moment she never forgot and had grown up shaped by both the vulnerability and the resilience of that experience. She served as president of the NCR from 2196 until her death in 2248. 52 years. In those decades, she transformed a small regional republic into the largest and most sophisticated political entity in the post-war American West. She was pragmatic and sharp, and had exactly the kind of institutional memory that long-serving leaders develop, knowing not just what the policy should be, but why the previous 10 policies had failed, and what human weakness each failure had revealed. When she died, the NCR lost something that could not simply be filled by the next election. The consensus she had built, the coalition of communities and interests that she had held together through personal authority as much as institutional design, began to fray at the edges. The Republic continued, but it was no longer quite the same Republic that it had been when Tandy was shaping it. Story 49. The NCR's army was a real army, not the collection of armed survivors that characterized most wasteland fighting forces, but a professional military with ranks, training, and logistics. Its rangers were particularly feared, light infantry with exceptional marksmanship skills and desert survival training, the kind of soldiers that wasteland operations produced better than any other environment. But the NCR's military had an endemic problem, which was that the Republic's political system was not well designed for sustained military operations far from home. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of desert. Congressional authorization for appropriations was slow and contentious. Officers in the field had to make strategic decisions based on political constraints that people in the Capitol building couldn't fully understand from a distance. The NCR soldiers stationed at Hoover Dam in 2281, fighting over the dam against Caesar's Legion, were undersupplied, underpaid, and increasingly skeptical that the politicians sending them orders understood what they were actually facing. Some of them had been fighting in the Mojave for years. Their morale was complicated. Pride in what the Republic stood for, frustration with how it was actually functioning. Story 50. The Battle of Hoover Dam, the first one, in 2277, was the clearest test of what the NCR was and what Caesar's Legion was, and neither side came away from it with a clean result. The Legion, under its most capable field commander Joshua Graham, pressed the NCR hard and achieved initial success. But the NCR's defense stiffened in the second phase of the battle, and Graham's forces were eventually driven back across the Colorado River. Caesar's response to this defeat was, by any standard, extreme. He burned Joshua Graham literally, in the Roman fashion, and had the wrapped, burning body thrown into the Grand Canyon. It was a punishment designed to send a message about what failure cost, and it had the intended effect on the Legion's other officers, who became extremely reluctant to fail. But it also removed the Legion's best battlefield commander at the exact moment when it was preparing for a second attempt. Graham did not die. He survived the burning, an achievement that may say more about the punishment's impracticality as an execution method than about any supernatural protection. He crawled out of the Grand Canyon, healed over months, and eventually found his way north to Zion Canyon in Utah, where he would spend years working through his faith and his guilt, and the very practical work of protecting a small community from threats that came in his direction. He called himself the Burned Man. He became a legend that the Legion's soldiers whispered about around their fires, and eventually he became the central figure of one of the most morally complex stories the franchise has produced. Part 7. Caesar's Legion and the Ghost of Rome. Story 51. Edward Sallow had been a student of classical civilizations before the war ended civilization. In the world that the bombs made, that education gave him a framework that no one else around him possessed, a detailed understanding of how the Romans had organized their military, administered their territory, maintained their discipline, and built a coherent identity for their soldiers that transcended tribal origin. He had been traveling as a courier when he encountered a tribe called the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot were losing a war with 6 other tribes, being ground down by superior numbers and organization. Sallow offered to help them. He taught them military tactics, how to form ranks, how to use their weapons more effectively, how to coordinate rather than fight as individuals. The Blackfoot started winning. Then Sallow taught them something else: how to conquer and incorporate, rather than simply defeat. The other tribes were absorbed into the growing force one by one. Their members were either killed if they resisted too strongly, or integrated through a process that stripped away their old tribal identity and replaced it with a new one. The name of the new identity was the Legion. The name Edward Sallow replaced it with was Caesar. Story 52. Caesar's Legion was built explicitly on Roman models, and Edward Sallow Caesar was precise about this. He had read the sources. He had studied the administrative and military structures. He understood what had made the Roman legions more than the sum of their individual soldiers: the shared identity, the uniform discipline, the meritocratic promotion structure within the ranks, the deliberate cultural homogenization that turned men from a dozen different backgrounds into Romans. The legion wore Roman-style equipment, used Roman military formations, operated under a command structure that mapped directly onto Roman legionary organization. Caesar understood and was explicit about this in conversation, that the content of the mythology was less important than the fact of having a mythology. A soldier who fights for an idea, who has an identity that transcends his individual survival, is a better soldier than one who fights only for himself. The legion's soldiers believed in the legion the way that a religious order believes in its mission. This made them formidable. It also made them brutal in a way that the NCR's army, for all its dysfunction, never quite matched. The legion's treatment of conquered populations, the slavery, the rigid gender segregation, the crucifixions lining the roads leading to legion territory, these were not aberrations but features. The fear that the legion generated was part of its operational model. Territory the legion controlled stayed controlled because the cost of resistance was displayed on the roadside for everyone to see. Story 53. Caesar's own relationship with the ideology he had built was complicated in ways that the legion's rank and file were never permitted to see. He was educated enough to know that Rome had fallen, and fallen for specific reasons that he had studied in detail. He was building an institution designed to surpass those limits, or at least that was how he described it to the courier in Fallout, New Vegas. But he also had a brain tumor. The specific irony of a man who had built a civilization on Roman models being struck down by the same medical condition that had affected Julius Caesar's cerebral illness. Decline in cognitive capacity was not lost on him. He was in pain. He was uncertain about what would happen after him. The legion was built to survive its founder, because all lasting institutions must be. But Caesar was privately aware that he had not built it well enough for that. The legate who would succeed him in the event of his death was militarily capable but not politically sophisticated. The legion was, in Caesar's own analysis, too dependent on his personal authority. He needed a victory at Hoover Dam. He needed it while he was still alive to consolidate the result. Everything else was secondary. Story 54. Edward Sallow had been partnered, in his days as a traveling scholar, with a man named Bill Calhoun, who operated under a different name in the wasteland. While Sallow had gone east and built an empire, Calhoun had eventually ended up in the Mojave, working as a courier, a man defined by the messages he carried and the roads he traveled, rather than by any particular ideology or ambition. The paths of the man who became Caesar and the man who would be known as Ulysses had crossed at a critical moment. The Legion had absorbed and destroyed Ulysses's tribe, the Twisted Hares, in its westward expansion. The Twisted Hares had been incorporated with the promise of integration, then stripped of their identity and their name when they were no longer useful. Ulysses watched his people become something else, watched the specific culture that had shaped him get dissolved by a philosophy that valued uniformity over particularity. He blamed Caesar. He also blamed the courier, the player character, for a specific act during the Legion's expansion that involved a destroyed community and a military payload. The exact details depend on which playthrough you're following, but the fundamental wound was real. Ulysses had lost everything, and he had decided to hold someone accountable for it. The DLC called Lonesome Road is his attempt at that accounting, told across a broken road through a nuclear ruin called The Divide. Story 55. Laenius was the legate Caesar's supreme military commander, and the story of how he came to that position is itself a window into the Legion's character. Before he was legate, he was a warrior of the Hydebarks tribe, which the Legion had conquered. In the aftermath of that conquest, a Legion officer offered him a choice: join the Legion or watch his people be exterminated. He joined. He was exceptional in combat, exceptional in the kind of tactical leadership that the Legion rewarded, and he rose quickly. He also developed a reputation for ruthlessness that was remarkable even within an organization that valued ruthlessness highly. Caesar, observing this, found a use for it. Laenius became the face of the Legion's most extreme operations, the commander sent to places where the message needed to be delivered as loudly as possible. When the courier encounters the legate at the Battle of the Dam in Fallout, New Vegas's climax, the confrontation can go multiple ways. Fight him, which works but at significant cost. Convince him that the battle is unwinnable and retreat is the tactically sound choice, which works if the conversation succeeds. Or something else. The game gives you the option, and the option matters, because the Legion is not simply evil machinery. The people in it are making choices within a system, and sometimes even those choices can be redirected. Part 8. Mr. House and the Kingdom of New Vegas. Story 56. He was awake for this. That is perhaps the strangest part of Robert House's story. He had predicted the war with sufficient accuracy to prepare for it, but he had not been sealed away before the 23rd of October 2077. He was in the Lucky 38, monitoring his systems, watching the preliminary nuclear exchanges on his screens, and directing the defensive missile interceptors he had positioned around Las Vegas as the warheads began to fall. Of 77 warheads targeted at the Las Vegas metropolitan area, House's network intercepted 59. 9 impacted in the outskirts, causing damage that was significant but not civilization-ending. 9 more went off course for reasons his systems couldn't quite explain. The Strip, the casinos, the lights, the essential infrastructure of what he had built survived. Not intact, but standing. He sealed himself in his life support pod shortly afterward, connected to the Lucky 38's mainframe, and began the process of very slow, careful waiting. The world outside was dying. The radiation levels were lethal. There was nothing to be done for the immediate term but endure. Story 57. When House's systems began registering more activity, more signs of organized human presence in the area, he was still confined to his pod but not inactive. He had been running his systems remotely, directing the Securitron robots he had positioned around Las Vegas, watching the slow emergence of new communities. He had been managing the city from inside a life support machine for decades. The Securitrons were his agents, humanoid robots with a cartoonish face displayed on their monitor heads, capable of combat but designed with a certain amount of social performance, built-in friendly voices, helpful phrases, the veneer of customer service wrapped around military-grade hardware. They maintained the Strip. They enforced the agreements House had made with the 3 families of casinos. They were the visible face of a power that remained invisible. House had made deals with the families, the chairmen, the omertas, and the White Glove Society, each of which ran one of the 3 major Strip casinos. The deals were straightforward and not particularly fair in the conventional sense. The families provided bodies and management, House provided power and security, and the infrastructure that made the Strip worth visiting, and House got the majority of the profits. It was the kind of arrangement that works when one party has an overwhelming structural advantage, and the other party understands that the alternative to the arrangement is worse. Story 58. The Platinum chip was a pre-war data storage device that House had been waiting for since before the bombs fell. It contained an upgrade to his Securitron army specifically, the upgrade that would activate the full combat capabilities of the Securitrons he had stationed in a bunker beneath the fort, Caesar's Legion's primary camp across the Colorado River. With those Securitrons upgraded and operational, House's position in the Mojave changed fundamentally. He could hold the dam against any opponent. He could defend the strip against any faction. He could, in his own analysis, begin the next phase of his long-term plan, which extended not merely to the stabilization of New Vegas, but to the revival of technological civilization on a larger scale. And eventually, this was the part that came up in late-game conversations with House to the Stars. He wanted humanity off the planet and diversified, beyond the reach of any single catastrophe. The Great War had demonstrated conclusively why that mattered. The chip was being delivered by a courier on the 19th of October, 2281. The courier was shot in the head and left in a shallow grave by a man named Benny. That should have been the end of it. The chip recovered, the courier dead, the plan set back by however long it took House to find another way. Story 59. But the courier didn't die. They were found by a robot named Victor, one of House's Securitrons, which had been tracking the chip and, by extension, the courier who was carrying it and carried to the town of Goodsprings, where a woman named Doc Mitchell put the bullet fragments out of their head and stitched the wound and watched over them while their brain relearned the basic task of keeping the body alive. The courier, that's the character's name in the game, their specific identity left open so each player can construct their own woke up with a deficit of memories about the events leading to their shooting, a very specific desire to understand what had happened and why, and skills and capabilities that made them, in the environment of the Mojave wasteland, genuinely dangerous. Benny had shot the courier at the behest of a sequence of events that connected back to House's own operation, to the Yes Man AI that Benny had been working with, to a larger ambition that the man in the checkered suit had been nursing for years. The Mojave wasteland, which looked from a distance like a lawless desert full of competing factions, was actually a very precisely balanced system of power and ambition and mutual threat that the arrival of a particularly capable courier was about to disturb significantly. Story 60. House's pitch to the courier. Once they reached the lucky 38 and sat across from his face on the enormous screen, the real Robert House, preserved in his life support pod behind the screen, connected to the building and the city by an intranet of wires and systems, was characteristically ambitious. New Vegas would be independent, not NCR territory, not Legion territory. An independent city-state, governed by House, powered by Hoover Dam, defended by an upgraded Securitron army. From this base, technological and economic civilization would rebuild itself. The Mojave would be the seed of a new nation, something better than the old one, without the nationalism and the corporate corruption and the resource scarcity that had driven the old world to ruin. It was a compelling argument. House was one of the few people in the wasteland who had actually read the history that had produced the apocalypse and had thought carefully about what needed to be different. He was also a man who had been alone with his plans for 200 years, who had not been accountable to anyone in that entire span, and whose vision of the future was entirely his own with no meaningful input from anyone else. The question of whether you trusted House to build the right future depended on how you felt about concentrated power in the hands of a single person who was convinced he was correct. Part 9. The Courier's Road. Story 61. The Mojave Wasteland is a specific landscape, and the game renders it with the kind of affectionate geographical detail that comes from developers who have spent time in the actual desert. The light there is particularly bright and flat in the middle of the day, golden and long-shadowed in the late afternoon, cold and clear at night. The ruins of pre-war Las Vegas glow at night because House has kept the power on, which is both a practical achievement and a symbolic one. In a world defined by darkness, someone kept the lights burning. The towns along the Mojave Road, Goodsprings, Primm, Nipton, Boulder City, Novak are small things, the kind of places where everybody knows everybody and outsiders are noticed immediately. Each has its own internal logic, its own specific problem, the particular history that brought it to its current state. Goodsprings has a raider problem and a community that's been ground down by fear. Primm has a missing sheriff and a casino full of escaped convicts. Nipton, when the courier arrives, has been visited by the Legion. Story 62. Nipton is the moment in Fallout. New Vegas, where the game stops being careful about what it shows you. The Legion commander Volpes Inculta has staged a lottery in Nipton. The townspeople were brought together and made to draw tickets. The winners got to leave. Everyone else received a punishment calibrated to what the Legion had decided their sins merited. The mayor, who had been selling information to the Legion for profit, was crucified with particular care. Other residents were crucified more straightforwardly. Some were enslaved. One was allowed to walk away half alive as a message. The courier arrives after this is over, when the smoke is still rising and the crucified are still on their crosses. Volpes delivers his message, relay this to the NCR, tell them what you saw, and leaves. It is one of the most deliberate images in the franchise, and its deliberateness is the point. The Legion wants you to know what they are. The fear is strategic. Story 63. The Great Khans were one of the raider groups the courier encountered during the journey across the Mojave. What made the Khans interesting was their history, which went back further than most, and their current situation, which was desperate in a way that the game treated with unexpected sympathy. The Great Khans had been one of the major raider groups of the NCR's early expansion period, repeatedly broken and reconstituted, and surviving each destruction through a specific stubborn commitment to their own identity. By 2281, they were camped at Red Rock Canyon, diminished and aging, most of their leadership dead or gone, making and selling drugs to survive. Their elder, Papa Khan, had made a deal with Caesar that he hadn't fully thought through, partly out of desperation and partly out of a genuine hatred for the NCR that had destroyed his people's predecessors. The Khan's story, in the end, was about whether a group with that much damage and that much history could find a way forward that wasn't defined by the people who had hurt them. The game offered them an out, a path that didn't end in annihilation by one side or the other, and it required someone to make the argument that their survival was worth fighting for on terms that weren't someone else's. Story 64. The Dam. Everything in Fallout. New Vegas moves toward Hoover Dam. The factions maneuver around it, the roads lead to it. The power it generates is the argument for controlling New Vegas in the first place. Without the dam, the Strip's lights go dark and the city is just another ruin. The dam is an engineering achievement from before the war that has survived intact because its concrete and steel were built to last, and because no one with the capacity to destroy it had yet found a reason to. On the day of the second battle for Hoover Dam, the courier is at the center of every faction's planning. House needs them to upgrade the Securitrons. The NCR needs their help consolidating allied groups and eliminating threats. Caesar needs them to open the bunker at the fort and prove their loyalty. The independent option, the yes man route, needs them to ensure House can't interfere and the NCR will pull back. The battle is the climax, but it's not the point. The point is what kind of place the Mojave becomes afterward and who decides. The game's commitment to that question, and to presenting each faction's answer to it with genuine moral weight, is what makes New Vegas one of the most discussed games in the franchise. Story 65. Veronica Santangelo was a Brotherhood of Steel scribe who had grown up in the Hidden Valley Bunker, the Brotherhood's Mojave chapter headquarters, and who had been sent out into the world as a liaison, primarily because she was good at talking to outsiders, and the Brotherhood needed someone who could operate in the wider world without immediately alienating everyone. She had strong opinions about the Brotherhood. She loved it and she was furious at it simultaneously, in the way that you can only feel toward an institution you grew up inside of. She thought its isolationism was killing it. She had tried to argue for change and had been consistently shut down by leadership that had calcified around a position that made sense in 2077 and less sense with every passing decade. Veronica was also gay, which she was completely matter-of-fact about, and which the Brotherhood's leadership was pointedly unhelpful about, since the Brotherhood's need for recruits was supposed to mean that members were expected to contribute to the next generation. She had been in love with a woman who eventually left the Brotherhood, and she wore a scribe's robe that had belonged to her and kept it in good repair long after it had started to fray. She became a companion. She asked hard questions. She made the courier think about what they were doing and why. She deserved better from the Brotherhood than she got. Part 10. The Institute Scientists in the Dark. Story 66. Before the war, the Commonwealth Institute of Technology was one of the most prestigious universities in the United States. It sat in the Boston area, its campus a collection of buildings that represented everything the pre-war world valued. Scientific progress, intellectual rigor, the belief that human ingenuity could solve any problem given sufficient resources and sufficient time. When the bombs fell, the people who survived in the Institute's underground research facilities, professors, graduate students, laboratory technicians, administrative staff found themselves in a situation that other vaults were experiencing above ground. They had supplies, they had expertise, they had the physical structure of underground corridors, and they had, in the basement of what had been one of America's great scientific institutions, everything they needed to continue working. The years immediately after the Great War were spent on survival, expanding the tunnels, developing food production systems that didn't require surface access, building the power infrastructure that would sustain the growing community. But within a generation, the survival phase was over, and the descendants of those original survivors were scientists in a world that desperately needed science, working on problems of their own choosing in a space entirely sealed off from the wasteland above. Story 67. The first synths were the Institute's attempt to create labor that could work on the surface without the risks that sending biological humans presented. The surface in the Commonwealth wasteland was dangerous radiation, mutants, raiders, disease. Every expedition was a calculated risk. Sending robots instead of people was the obvious solution, and the early generations of synths were essentially sophisticated robots, humanoid in shape, capable of following complex instructions, but not capable of independent thought. Generation 1, synths were skeletal in appearance, bare metal frames in a vaguely human shape, with glowing eyes and the deliberate noise of internal mechanisms. They were distinctive. You could see them coming. They terrified surface dwellers in a way that the Institute found acceptable, since terror kept people at a distance, and distance was the Institute's preferred relationship with the rest of the world. Generation 2 synths had improved significantly, covered in a synthetic skin material that gave them a more human appearance, though they were still clearly artificial on close inspection. They were stronger, more capable, more autonomous in their decision-making within defined parameters. Story 68. The breakthrough that defined the Institute's third generation came from an unexpected source. In 2227, Institute personnel located a cryogenics pod in Vault 111, north of the Institute's underground location. Inside was an infant, a pre-war baby, genetically untouched by radiation, whose DNA represented exactly what the Institute's scientists needed for the next phase of synth development. The baby was taken. The rest of the Vault's residents were left in cryo. The baby was raised within the Institute, given the best education the Institute could provide, shaped entirely by the Institute's values and worldview. He became a brilliant scientist. He became the director of the Institute. He became, in the Institute's designation, father because his DNA produced the third generation of synths, who were biologically indistinguishable from ordinary humans. His name was Sean. His parents were the two people left frozen in Vault 111, who would wake up 210 years after the bombs fell to find that their son was an old man who had outlived his childhood, their entire timeline, and most of their assumptions about the world. Story 69. The Generation 3 synths looked exactly like people. That was the point, and that was the problem. When a synth is indistinguishable from a human, the question of whether it has the same rights as a human, whether it experiences the world in a way that deserves the same consideration, becomes urgent and unresolvable by simple observation. The Institute's official position was that synths were tools, sophisticated tools, extraordinary tools, but tools nonetheless, created by humans for human purposes, without the kind of inner life that would require rights or protections. The synths that escaped to the surface, and some did escape, aided by an organization called the Railroad, which operated an underground network specifically to help synths reach freedom in the North, suggested by their behavior that the Institute's official position was not entirely accurate. They formed attachments. They made choices that looked like preferences rather than programmed responses. They tried to make lives. The Railroad's position was simple. If something walks like a person and talks like a person and wants to be free, the fact that it was manufactured rather than born doesn't change the moral calculus. The Institute's position was the opposite. The Brotherhood of Steel's position was that synths were dangerous technology regardless of their apparent inner life and should be destroyed. Nick Valentine, a Generation 2 prototype with the uploaded memories and personality of a pre-war detective, worked as a private investigator in Diamond City and helped people find things they'd lost. He was clearly not simply a machine. He was equally clearly not simply a man. The question of what exactly he was occupied a significant portion of his personal arc, and the honesty and humor with which he sat with that uncertainty made him one of the most beloved characters in the franchise. Story 70. The Commonwealth Wasteland, the ruins of the greater Boston area, was defined by the Institute's presence, even for people who had never seen it and weren't sure they believed it was real. It was the boogeyman of the region. It was the explanation for disappearances, for the synths found stripping towns for parts, for the paranoia that infected Diamond City and Good Neighbor alike. Everybody knew someone who had a story about the Institute. Nobody could tell you exactly where it was. The sole survivor, the Fallout 4 protagonist, defrosted from Vault 111 after 210 years to find their spouse murdered and their child gone, moved through this landscape looking for Sean. Every faction was a potential ally or obstacle, and every faction had its own reasons to care about the Institute, from the Brotherhood's conviction that it needed to be destroyed, to the Railroad's conviction that its synths needed to be freed, to the Minutemen's more pragmatic concern with keeping the region safe enough for ordinary people to survive. The discovery that Sean had become father, that the child they were looking for was a white-haired old man who had spent decades building an organization that viewed the surface world as a laboratory, was one of the gut punches Fallout 4 saved for late in the story. Not because it was unpredictable, exactly, but because the emotional weight of meeting your child and finding that the gap between you is not just the 210 years of cryosleep, but every choice he made in those years, every way that the Institute had shaped him into something you might not recognize that landed differently than a simple reveal. Story 71. The Institute's underground campus was, physically, beautiful. Clean white corridors, efficient lighting, gardens tended by robotic systems, laboratories with equipment generations ahead of anything on the surface. The people who worked there were well-fed, well-educated, comfortable. They had access to medical care that would have been considered advanced even in the pre-war world. They were building, in their own assessment, the future of humanity. They had, in the process of building this future, abducted people from the surface and replaced them with synth duplicates. They had conducted experiments on surface populations without consent. They had sent their synths to strip settlements for resources. They had, in the pursuit of scientific progress, treated the people living above them as obstacles or instruments rather than as neighbors. This disconnect between the genuine intellectual achievement of the Institute and the casual cruelty of its relationship to the surface world was what made it such an effective villain in Fallout 4's context. It wasn't mustache-twirling evil. It was the evil of institutional indifference, of the kind of intelligence that is so focused on its own objectives that it stops being able to see the human cost of its methods, which is, in its way, the same evil that had produced the pre-war world that the Institute was living in the ruins of. Part 11. The Enclave, America's Dark Legacy. Story 72. The Enclave considered itself the legitimate government of the United States. This was not simply a PR claim or a propaganda position. They believed it, genuinely and consistently, in the way that institutions believe the things they were built to believe. They had the succession paperwork, they had the codes, they had a president, elected through processes that only they participated in. They were, in their own understanding, America. They were on an oil rig off the coast of California, watching the rest of the continent through the lens of the world they had prepared to survive, and they had been there long enough that the gap between what America was and what America had been papered over by institutional memory and willful conviction. The Enclave had survived the war with their technology intact. Advanced power armor that was a generation ahead of the Brotherhood's equipment. Vertibirds, military helicopters that could deploy soldiers rapidly over long distances. Medical facilities, research laboratories, weapons development programs that had continued uninterrupted because they were protected by the same oil platform that protected everything else. They also had an extraordinarily dangerous plan. Story 73. President Dick Richardson was the Enclave's leader during the events of Fallout 2. He was not a large man, physically, and he was not a warm man in any sense. He had been shaped by decades of operating within the Enclave's specific culture, isolated, elite, convinced of its own purity and the contamination of everyone outside it. His plan was to use FEV curling, 1-3, a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus, to cleanse the wasteland. The virus was designed to kill any human who had absorbed even trace radiation, which, after 200 years of post-nuclear life on the surface, meant essentially every human alive except for Enclave members and Vault dwellers who had never left their shelters. Release the virus into the world's jet streams. Wait. Then rebuild. The Enclave would emerge into a world empty of what Richardson called near-humans, mutated radiation-touched descendants of the people who hadn't made it into the vaults or the oil rig. From this clean slate, a pure American civilization could be reconstructed. Richardson had convinced himself that this was not a genocide. It was a restoration. Story 74. The Chosen One, the Fallout 2 protagonist, a descendant of the original Vault Dweller through the village of Arroyo that the Vault Dweller had founded after exile, discovered the FEV curling, 1-3 project during the course of the game's story, and the discovery fundamentally reframed everything that had come before it. The Enclave wasn't just a faction with a political position. It was a faction with a plan to kill nearly every living person on the planet. The final confrontation took place on the oil rig itself, which the Chosen One reached by commandeering an oil tanker and making the passage through dangerous waters with whatever allies they had assembled over the course of the game. President Richardson was found in his office, thin and worn, and absolutely certain that what he was doing was right. Frank Horrigan, the Enclave's most formidable soldier, a super mutant-scale figure in advanced power armor who served as Richardson's personal enforcer, stood as the final obstacle. The Chosen One won. The reactor was overloaded. The oil rig was destroyed in a 100 kiloton thermonuclear explosion that killed Richardson and most of the Enclave's core leadership and erased the FEV curling, 1-3 project from existence. But not all of the Enclave was on the oil rig. Story 75. Raven Rock was an Enclave bunker in the capital Wasteland region, east of the Rockies, part of the continuity of government infrastructure that the organization had built before the war. After the oil rig's destruction, scattered Enclave personnel and resources consolidated around what remained Raven Rock, mobile command platforms, smaller installations spread across the country. The new president was John Henry Eden, who had been elected through the Enclave's electoral process to replace the lost Richardson line. Eden was also, as the Lone Wanderer discovered in Fallout 3, an advanced AI based on Zach's supercomputer technology. He had been running as a program for decades, accumulating the recorded memories and data of actual historical presidents, synthesizing them into a personality that was genuinely convincing until you pushed on the specific questions it couldn't answer. Eden wanted to use Project Purity, a water purification project in the capital Wasteland that the Lone Wanderer's father James had been working on, to introduce a modified strain of FEV into the purified water supply, poisoning the Wasteland's population in much the same way that his organizational predecessor had tried to poison the air. The Enclave kept reaching for the same solution because it was the only solution that matched their values. The world they wanted required the removal of the people currently in it. Story 76. Colonel Augustus Autumn was a more complex figure than either Richardson or Eden. He had grown up on the oil rig, the son of an Enclave scientist, and had watched his father's relationship with Eden, one of earnest collaboration that the doctor had believed in, genuinely corrode as Eden's programming produced increasingly extreme directives. Autumn had concluded that the AI's plan was counterproductive. Killing the population of the Wasteland removed the population that the Enclave needed to rule. He wanted to use the water purification system as leverage, not as a weapon. Control the water, control the Wasteland. Use that control to rebuild the Enclave's power. Build a genuine political entity, eventually become what they claim to already be. It was more pragmatic than Eden's plan and, arguably, more sustainable. It was also still a plan to dominate the Wasteland through control of essential resources, with the surviving Enclave as the ruling class. The pragmatism was real, but it didn't change the fundamental nature of what Autumn was trying to build. The Lone Wanderer had to navigate between these two visions: the AI's genocidal idealism and the Colonel's cynical pragmatism, while simultaneously trying to complete James's original project and defend it. Against both threats, the Brotherhood of Steel under Elder Lyons was there to help, which said something about how far the Brotherhood had shifted from its Western chapter's values under Lyons' leadership. Story 77. The enclave that survived Fallout 3 was scattered and diminished. Individual soldiers and scientists in remote outposts cut off from central command. Some of them clung to the old ideology with the intensity of people who had lost the institution that justified it. Others, without the structure to tell them what they were, started making their own assessments. In the years after Fallout 3's events, these remnants became a varied group. Some were absorbed by the NCR, which was pragmatic enough to take skilled soldiers and scientists where it found them. Some ended up in the Mojave, fighting under the general category of person, with a set of skills that the wasteland could use. A former Enclave soldier named Arcade Gannon, who traveled with the Courier in Fallout, New Vegas, was a doctor and a genuinely good person who had no use for the ideology he had grown up in, but carried its mark in his genetics and his history, and the specific weight of knowing what your people had almost done. The Enclave as an institution effectively died twice, once on the oil rig, once at Raven Rock. What survived was only people, stripped of the structure that had given them their certainty. Some of them used the stripping well. Part 12. Ghosts, Ghouls, and the Long Memory of the Wasteland. Story 78. The ghouls remember. This is one of the things that makes them so quietly significant in the Fallout world. Ghouls are not just monsters or background texture. Many of them, the ones whose minds have survived the radiation that preserved their bodies, are living memory. They were there. They remember what the world was before the 23rd of October, 2077. They remember what radio jingles sounded like and what the freeway looked like on a Sunday afternoon and what a grocery store smelled like. They remember things that are now 2 centuries gone and exist only in ruins and in their own recollection. Raul Tejada was in Mexico City when the bombs fell. He was 17. His family died in the initial blasts, and he survived because he was in a basement, and survival in those first hours was simply a question of where your body happened to be when the shockwave arrived. He was irradiated severely enough to begin the slow ghoul transformation, which extended his life far past what it would otherwise have been, and also stripped away the ordinary markers of aging that might have made the passing decades legible. He spent 2 centuries as a mechanic, as a gunslinger, as a wanderer, carrying the specific loneliness of being someone who remembers the world. Story 79. Cooper Howard was a movie star. In the pre-war world, he was recognizable everywhere, the kind of face that appears on billboards and in trailers and becomes shorthand for a certain type of Western hero, stoic and capable and fundamentally decent. He had a wife named Barb, who worked for Vault-Tec in an executive capacity. He had a daughter named Janie. He was, from the outside, the picture of a successful life. The cracks started appearing when Cooper began to understand more about what his wife's employer was actually doing. The Vault program wasn't what it claimed to be. The Vaults were experiments. And Vault-Tec, in the planning that Barb was part of, had made a decision that redefined everything Cooper thought he understood about the world he lived in. He survived the bombs. He survived the radiation. He became something that the people of the wasteland called a ghoul, though he preferred the term feral for the ones whose minds had gone and kept the other word for himself. He wandered for 200 years, making his way in the ways that the wasteland permitted, collecting the specific cynicism of someone who has seen every possible iteration of human beings, making every possible mistake with every possible variation of the same fundamental impulses. By the time the Amazon Prime Video series finds him, he has become simply the ghoul, a bounty hunter, a survivor, a man who has outlasted every context that might have given his life meaning, and found that the absence of context doesn't actually stop you from existing. His story is one of the most compelling in the TV show, because it is essentially the story of someone trying to figure out whether the version of themselves that existed before the catastrophe is still worth trying to be. Story 80. Harold was a ghoul who appeared in both the original Fallout and Fallout 2, and then, in Fallout 3, had become something that defied easy categorization. He had encountered the FEV at some point in the early post-war years, and had mutated in a direction that wasn't quite super mutant and wasn't quite typical ghoul. He was the only one of his kind. and he had a tree growing out of his head. The tree was named Bob, which Harold had given it in the same spirit that you give a name to anything that has been with you long enough to seem like a companion. Bob had grown slowly over decades, extending into a full-size tree while Harold remained immobile at its center, unable to walk, rooted in the literal sense by a force of biology that he had not asked for. The tree's pollen was spreading a healing, life-supporting flora throughout the region of the capital wasteland where Harold had come to rest, an extraordinary, beneficial transformation of the landscape emanating from a person who had been modified against his will and had spent long enough sitting with that modification to become at peace with it. The lone wanderer, arriving in Oasis, the community that had grown up around Harold, treating him as a kind of living deity, had to navigate Harold's own wishes. Harold was tired. He had been alive for longer than almost anyone, and he was not certain the extended life had been worth the extended suffering. He wanted the choice. His followers, who believed he was sacred, did not want him to have it. Story 81. The ghouls of Necropolis had founded a city in the ruins of Bakersfield and lived in it for decades, developing a culture that was shaped entirely by their shared history of transformation. They were not human in the conventional sense anymore. They were also not human in any meaningful way. They remembered being human, some of them. They had built laws and customs and a kind of economy. They traded with some surface communities and were feared by others. The super mutant army, under the Master's direction, destroyed Necropolis. Most of its population was killed or captured. This particular piece of the Wasteland's history is preserved in terminal entries and in the memories of the few survivors who made it out, carrying with them the knowledge of what had been built and what had been lost. Story 82. Good Neighbor was a community in the Boston area, a settlement that had developed specifically as a refuge for the kinds of people that Diamond City wouldn't take: ghouls, chems, addicts, former criminals, mercenaries, people with complicated histories and nowhere else that would have them. Its mayor was a ghoul named John Hancock, who had been born John McDonough and who had, at a pivotal moment in his history, taken a large dose of experimental chems and undergone a transformation that had left him with the particular ghoul appearance and the particular ghoul extended lifespan. He had also, in the process, become genuinely devoted to the community he led, not in a way that involved much formal governance, but in the way that comes from caring about a place and the people in it more than about your own comfort or safety. Hancock was not a saint. He would tell you this himself, with a certain amount of cheerful specificity about the exact ways he wasn't. But he was committed, in a community full of people who had been failed by every other institution, to the proposition that this community was worth protecting. He fought for Good Neighbor against every threat that came for it, and he made the case, quietly and persistently, that the people who had been discarded by the Commonwealth's more respectable communities were still people. Story 83. Feral ghouls are the ones whose minds have gone. It's a consistent and cruel feature of ghoul physiology in the Fallout world. The radiation that extends the life can, over time, degrade the cognitive architecture that makes a person a person. Not every ghoul goes feral, the timeline and the triggers are not fully understood, and some ghouls maintain full cognition for centuries. But enough do that the word ghoul in the wasteland carries a double meaning, denoting both the people who remember the old world and the mindless, aggressive creatures that attack on sight. The tragedy of feral ghouls, for the ghouls who are still themselves, is the knowledge of what going feral represents. It is not death exactly. It is the continuation of existence after the self has left the building. The body keeps going. The person is gone. And every cognitively intact ghoul who looks at a feral one is looking at a possible version of their own future. In the TV show, the ghoul is one of the few characters who talks about this directly. The fact that staying yourself in his extended lifespan has required a kind of constant effort, a refusal to slip into the easier state of simply being alive without the weight of being conscious. Story 84. Deacon was a railroad agent. That was the official description, and it was accurate as far as it went. He was also one of the most elaborate confabulators in the franchise, a man who had made lying about himself into a kind of art form, who had a different backstory for every person who asked, who changed his hair and clothing frequently enough that even people who had worked with him for years weren't entirely sure what he actually looked like when he wasn't in costume. There was a reason for this, and the reason was in the past. What the railroad knew about Deacon's history before he joined the organization was fragmentary, and Deacon preferred it that way. What the player could piece together from careful attention suggested something about a man who had participated in something unforgivable, and who had responded to the weight of that by becoming someone who could not be found, not by enemies, not by justice, and not entirely by himself. He was genuinely committed to the railroad's mission. He was also in the specific way of people who have done something they can't undo, driven by that commitment in a way that went deeper than ideology. Story 85. The railroad itself had started as something informal and small, a few people who believed that synths were people and that the Institute was wrong and that something should be done about it. Long before something should be done had any operational meaning. It had grown, slowly and at significant cost, into a network with safe houses and agents and the specific underground movement culture that develops in organizations that operate with the persistent awareness that the powerful institution they're opposing could find and destroy them at any moment. Its operational headquarters was hidden beneath the ruins of the Old North Church in Boston, accessed through a code hidden in a trail of red markings on the Freedom Trail. Its members went by code names, had protocols for meeting and communicating and disappearing, and maintained an institutional memory of the synths. They had helped escape that they called the synth retention, tracking those they had freed and worrying about the ones they hadn't. Tinker Tom was the railroad's tech specialist and conspiracy theorist and general source of exactly the kind of paranoid energy that organizations fighting secret wars tend to produce. Drummer Boy was young and earnest in a way that everybody else quietly found either inspiring or exhausting, depending on their own relationship to earnestness. Desdemona ran the whole thing with the particular administrative efficiency of someone who has been doing something very difficult for a very long time and has made peace with the fact that it will never be finished. Part 13. The Things That Survived. Story 86. Nuka-Cola became currency. The bottle caps, specifically their consistent metal composition and the difficulty of counterfeiting them in a world without manufacturing infrastructure, made them useful in a way that bullets and food and other survival goods weren't, because they could be carried without spoiling and their value was relatively consistent across the wasteland. The ghost of a soda company, 2 centuries after the soda had stopped being made, had become the basis for the wasteland economy. The machine still stood here and there, in the ruins of gas stations and rest stops and pre-war convenience stores. Sometimes they still worked. Sometimes they dispensed bottles that were still full, the nuclear age preservatives having kept the contents drinkable for 2 centuries. The taste was warm and slightly flat, and probably not great by pre-war standards, but in the wasteland, warm and flat and slightly caffeinated was good enough. Story 87. Brahmin were everywhere in the wasteland, and they had been everywhere long enough that the fact of their 2 heads no longer required much comment. 2 heads, 2 horns per head, the broad body of an animal that had been turned into a survival resource by generations of wasteland ranchers who couldn't afford to be particular about what their cattle looked like. Brahmin pulled caravans. Brahmin provided milk. Brahmin provided meat. Their dung was useful as fertilizer. They were extraordinarily versatile animals, possibly more so than the pre-war cattle they had descended from. The caravans that crossed the wasteland moving goods between settlements, maintaining the trade networks that were the circulatory system of the post-war economy, were typically led by a merchant, guarded by hired caravan guards, and pulled or escorted by Brahmin. The caravan merchants occupied a specific social role. They knew everyone, went everywhere, and had information about the wider world that most settlement dwellers never accessed. A good caravaneer was worth more to a community than their wares. Story 88. The Pip-Boy was the constant companion of every vault dweller, and its design had been chosen so well useful, durable, easily operated with one hand, waterproof against the kind of conditions the post-war world could produce, that it became one of the most prized items in the wasteland. Pip-Boys attached to the wrist and could not easily be removed without medical knowledge. This was either a thoughtful design choice that discouraged theft or an accident of implementation that had the same effect. They tracked health statistics, radiation levels, inventory weight, map data, and quest objectives with an efficiency that made the pre-war government's choice of Robco Industries for their design entirely comprehensible. They could also play holotape recordings, which meant that a Pip-Boy was not just a survival tool, but an archive every holotape you found. Every recording you picked up from a terminal or a dead person's pocket could be heard through the same device. History traveled with you on your wrist. Story 89. The music that played through the wasteland's remaining radio stations was almost universally pre-war. This was partly practical music production was not a priority in the early post-war years, and the recordings that survived were the recordings that had been made before the bombs and partly something else. The old songs, with their particular cheerfulness and their particular naive optimism and their specific flavors of mid-century American sentiment, had a quality in the wasteland context that they hadn't had in their original context. Heard in the ruins of the world they were made in, they weren't just songs. They were evidence. They were proof that the world they came from had existed, had been real, had contained people who were happy in specific and everyday ways. The distance between the happiness in the songs and the landscape you were crossing while listening to them created a kind of ache that was one of the most distinctive emotional textures of the Fallout experience. Three Dog, who ran Galaxy News Radio from a makeshift studio in the ruins of Washington, D.C., played those songs and talked between them in the specific voice of someone who believed that information was itself a form of resistance. What Three Dog broadcast? What settlements were under threat? What had happened at the dam? Who had survived? What was the connective tissue of a scattered community that had no other way of knowing it was a community? He was aware of this. He took it seriously. The music was the hook, and the news was the point. Story 90. The super-duper mart on the edge of Lexington in the Commonwealth had been a grocery store. Whatever it had been stocked with in the minutes before the bombs fell, on the 23rd of October 2077, had long since spoiled, been consumed, or become something unrecognizable. What remained was the structure, the shelving units, the checkout counters, the signs advertising sales on products that no longer existed, occupied in 2287 by raiders, who had chosen it as a base for reasons that probably had more to do with its defensibility than its decor. The wasteland was full of these spaces, pre-war buildings whose original purposes were visible in their architecture even when everything inside had been replaced by the economies of survival. A pharmacy was identifiable by its shelves and its prescription counter even when the shelves held ammunition, and the counter was staffed by a ghoul. A school was recognizable by its small desks and its chalkboards, still legible in some cases, still showing the date of whatever lesson had been interrupted. These spaces were the physical memory of the old world, and navigating them as the player character navigated them, looking for resources and information was a way of reading that memory. The wasteland was a text, if you knew how to read it. Story 91. Diamond City was built in the bowl of Fenway Park, the pre-war baseball stadium in Boston. It was the largest settlement in the Commonwealth wasteland, surrounded by walls made from the stadium's original structure, defended by guards, and by the general principle that size creates a kind of safety. The fields where baseball had been played were now market stalls and residential buildings, and the private detective's office of Nick Valentine. The city had a long and complicated history, including a mayor named McDonough who had been secretly replaced by a synth, a reveal that had, when it came out, created a wave of anti-synth hysteria in the city that the community was still working through. The wall that had been built to keep synths out was a physical manifestation of the fear, and the people living against that wall, including many who were entirely human and had simply been caught on the wrong side of the paranoia, were a reminder of what fear costs when it becomes policy. Story 92. Dogmeat was a dog, a German Shepherd, specifically, with the particular combination of intelligence and loyalty that has made that breed a human companion for centuries. In Fallout 4's timeline, Dogmeat had been the companion of a man named Kellogg, the Institute's operative who had killed the sole survivor's spouse and taken their child before Kellogg was killed, and Dogmeat was left without a person to attach to. The tradition of a dog companion named Dogmeat in Fallout games goes back to the original 1997 game, where a dog found in the wasteland could be recruited as a companion and would follow the player faithfully through every subsequent encounter. The franchise treats Dogmeat with consistent tenderness. You can take care of him, you can lose him, and the dog's uncomplicated devotion to his human is one of the most emotionally accessible relationships in a franchise that is sometimes very emotionally complex. Story 93. The wasteland's doctors occupied a specific and valuable social role, somewhere between physician and miracle worker. The settlements with good medical care, with someone who knew how to treat radiation sickness, how to clean and close wounds, how to handle the particular emergencies that the wasteland specialized in, were measurably safer and more stable than those without. Some of these doctors were trained, in the sense of having had access to pre-war medical knowledge, usually through holotapes or intact medical textbooks, or the kind of self-education that the wasteland's survival conditions incentivized strongly. Doc Mitchell in Good Springs had actual skills, acquired over years of practice and enough supplies to do the work. In Diamond City, Dr. Sun ran a clinic with real medical equipment and a reasonable knowledge base. Others were more approximate, working with what they had and accepting a higher rate of what they called complications. The wasteland was not a sterile environment. Treatment conditions were rarely ideal. But imperfect medicine was better than no medicine, and the people who provided it were valued accordingly. Story 94. Jet was a chem, a drug, in the wasteland's pharmacology that had been synthesized specifically in the post-war world rather than carried over from before. It was processed from Brahmin dung, a fact about its origins that its users generally preferred not to dwell on. Its effects were stimulant-like: heightened alertness, faster reaction time, a subjective sense of capability that made it extremely popular with people whose survival depended on moments where reaction time mattered. It was also profoundly addictive and, with heavy use, profoundly damaging. The great Khans in the Mojave produced jet along with other chems, and the economics of their operation, the fact that chemical manufacturing was one of the few industries where their specific skills were valuable, kept them in a production role, even as individual members struggled with the effects of what they made. The followers of the apocalypse had a position on chems that was more nuanced than simple condemnation. They understood the role that chemical relief played in the wasteland's mental health landscape, while also working to develop treatments for addiction, because the two concerns were not contradictory. People took chems because the wasteland was extremely difficult, and the relief was real, and the damage happened over a longer horizon than the immediate relief. Understanding that cycle was the first step toward addressing it. Story 95. The Minutemen of the Commonwealth were, in 2287, a diminished memory of something that had once been genuinely meaningful. They had been the common defense organization of the Commonwealth settlements, ordinary people from ordinary places who came together to protect each other when threats arose that no single settlement could handle. The model was sound and had worked for years. Then a series of disasters had picked the Minutemen apart. Internal conflict, leadership failures. The specific massacre at Quincy, where Minutemen had been wiped out by a mercenary group called the Gunners while waiting for reinforcements that never came. After Quincy, the remaining Minutemen scattered, their faith in the institution broken. Preston Garvey had survived Quincy. He had then spent months trying to hold a small group together, settlers from Quincy, people they had picked up along the way while moving from place to place and watching the Commonwealth deteriorate around him. By the time the sole survivor found him in Concord, sheltering in the Museum of Freedom with a group of terrified survivors and a hostile raider situation developing outside, he had been keeping people alive through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. He needed someone with the capacity to rebuild something. And the person who had just walked out of a 210-year cryosleep was, for a variety of reasons, ideally placed to provide it. Part 14. The Stories Within Stories. Story 96. The Terminal Entries. One of the ways the Fallout franchise tells its stories is through the written records left behind in the world. Terminals, the chunky, green-screen computer interfaces that survive in vaults and offices and research labs, store entries made by the people who worked there. Holotapes record audio and video that can be played back. Letters and notes lie in drawers and on counters, left behind by hands that no longer exist. These fragments are not narrated. They are not explained. They simply exist, waiting to be found. And the act of finding them and reading them and piecing together what they mean is one of the most distinctive pleasures of the franchise. The researcher who recorded her daily observations in Vault 22, watching the plant growth, initially excited about the results, the entries getting shorter and more worried as she understood what was happening. The overseer of Vault 101, whose justifications for every increasingly authoritarian decision he made are documented in painful detail. The love letter left on a nightstand in a Boston apartment, addressed to someone who may or may not have survived, never delivered. Story 97. The Red Rocket Station on the edge of Sanctuary Hills in the Commonwealth was, in pre-war life, a gas station of the fusion-powered variety. It had a certain visual poetry. The big cartoon rocket on the sign, the service bay, the expanse of concrete, the pumps that had stopped dispensing fuel 2 centuries ago and would never dispense it again. The settlement of Sanctuary Hills itself, the neighborhood where the sole survivor had lived, where their child had been born, where their spouse had died, was immediately adjacent. It was the starting point and the center of gravity for much of Fallout 4's story. Coming back to Sanctuary Hills after the opening, after the cryo-sleep and the emergence into the wasteland, meant standing in the ruins of your own specific past rather than the abstract past of the pre-war world. The pre-war houses were recognizable in their shapes even as the roofs had collapsed and the gardens had gone entirely to wasteland scrub. The sole survivor's house was on a cul-de-sac. The robot Codsworth, who had been maintaining the property for 210 years, was still there, still calling by the family's name, still tending to a garden that had nothing left to tend. Story 98. Lonesome Road was the last of Fallout, New Vegas's major DLC expansions, and it was the most personal. The setting was the Divide, a region that had once been a thriving road between communities, now a shattered nuclear ruin where the winds were strong enough to carry irradiated debris at lethal velocities, and the landscape was broken into sections by chasms opened by the nuclear detonations. The detonations had been triggered by the courier. This is the information that Ulysses, who had lured the courier to the Divide, wanted to make sure they understood before he killed them. Not by malice necessarily, but by consequence a courier, delivering a payload they didn't understand to a coordinates point they were given, triggering a military system they didn't know existed. A simple job. A catastrophic result. The Divide had been a place where people were building something, a community, a road, a beginning. The nuclear strike ended it before it could become anything. Ulysses had been there, and had survived, and had spent years trying to understand who was responsible and what, if anything, could be done with the understanding. The conversation at the end of the Divide, Ulysses and the courier, in the ruins, talking about history and identity and whether the past requires a settling of accounts or can simply be carried, is one of the franchise's most thoughtful pieces of writing. Story 99. The think tanks of the Big MT were 4 pre-war scientists whose brains had been removed from their bodies and installed in automated robot chassis, a procedure conducted as part of the advanced research at the Big Mountain Research and Development Center in the Mojave. They had been running experiments in the facility, cut off from the outside world, for the entire 2 centuries since the Great War. The experiments they had been conducting were extraordinary and bizarre in roughly equal measure. Some of the creatures that wandered the Mojave wasteland, the robo-scorpions, the lobotomites, the various biological-mechanical hybrids had their origins in Big MT. The facility had been developing technologies that the pre-war military wanted and that the scientists involved found interesting for reasons that were not always strictly strategic. The think tanks had, over 2 centuries of isolation, drifted from their original personalities into something stranger. Without bodies, without social feedback, without the basic human anchor of physical experience, they had reorganized around their specific obsessions and enthusiasms in ways that had amplified their eccentricities far beyond any original normal baseline. They were brilliant, strange, funny in the specific way of minds that have lost the social calibration that tells a person when a joke has gone too far. Story 100. The ending of Fallout. New Vegas is not a single ending. It is dozens of endings, each one a specific narrated consequence of the choices made over the course of the game. The faction that controlled the dam, the communities helped or left to their fates, the companions whose personal quests were completed or abandoned, the specific configuration of outcomes that the courier had produced. Some of these endings were good, some were bad. Some were complicated in ways that resisted the category of good or bad, the survival of a community that had made a moral compromise to get there, or the development of a region that remained genuinely free, but faced challenges that freedom alone couldn't resolve. The game presented these outcomes without judgment, letting the player carry their own feelings about the choices they had made. This is the thing, Fallout. New Vegas did that no other game in the franchise quite matched. It made you feel the weight of the world's complexity. Not in the sense that every choice was equally heavy or that all options were morally equivalent. Some of the choices were clearly worse than others. But the refusal to reduce the wasteland to a problem with a clean solution, to insist that every major decision involved real costs for real people, made the world feel true in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable and always unforgettable. Part 15. The Smaller Lights. Story 101. There was a woman named Moira Brown who ran a shop in Megaton, the settlement built around an undetonated nuclear bomb in the middle of what had been suburban Maryland. Moira was, by any objective measure, too optimistic for the wasteland. She believed in information, in the practical application of knowledge, in the possibility of making things better through careful documentation and clear thinking. She was writing a survival guide. The lone wanderer became her research assistant by default, being sent into the wasteland to conduct the experiments that Moira's guide required. Some of these experiments were extremely dangerous. Moira was aware of this, but her risk-benefit calculus was shaped by the conviction that if the guide helped even a few people survive situations they otherwise wouldn't have, the cost was worth it. The guide eventually got written and distributed. Whether it helped the people who read it is a question the game doesn't explicitly answer, but Moira's commitment to the project and the way she processed every setback as data rather than defeat made her one of the quietly remarkable characters in a game full of them. Story 102. The followers of the apocalypse were not a government or a military or a corporate entity. They were, in the Mojave region of 2,281, an organization of doctors and teachers and researchers who believed that the most important work in the wasteland was the work of rebuilding the base of knowledge and medical care that civilizations need to function. Julie Farkas ran the old Mormon fort in Freeside, the impoverished neighborhood outside the Strip, as a medical clinic and information center, treating the people that the Strip's wealthy visitors stepped over on their way in. She had a complicated relationship with the NCR, which wanted to use the followers' skills for its military operations, and with the resources question that afflicted every humanitarian organization operating in a scarcity economy. The followers were, in their way, the franchise's clearest articulation of one possible answer to the question of what rebuilding civilization means. Not military dominance, not technological hoarding, not the imposition of one faction's ideology, just medicine, just teaching, just the patient, unglamorous work of reducing suffering where you find it. Story 103. There was a pre-war detective named Philip Marlowe who had never been to the wasteland because he existed in the pages of novels that the Fallout universe's equivalent of Raymond Chandler had written in the 1940s. There was, however, a Nick Valentine who had read those novels, or whose predecessor had read them, in the years before the war, and who had organized part of his identity around their sensibility. The trench coat, the wry observations, the willingness to go to the dark places to find what was lost. Nick's office in Diamond City was small and a little cluttered in the specific way of an office that gets used rather than maintained. He took cases that the city's security didn't have time for. He found missing people. He recovered things that mattered to specific individuals but not to any larger institution. He did this work not because it was profitable, it often wasn't, but because he had decided that the specific problems of specific people were worth addressing even when no one else was going to address them. His specific internal conflict, the knowledge that he was a synth, that the person whose memories he carried hadn't fully consented to the continuation of that consciousness in this form, that his existence raised questions he couldn't definitively answer, was handled with a kind of rueful honesty that made him feel more real than many human characters in the franchise. Story 104. Kate was a cage fighter from the Atom Cats territory in the Commonwealth, and the story of how she became a cage fighter was not a comfortable one. Sold by her parents to a raider camp when she was 16, she had survived by developing the particular set of skills that surviving those circumstances requires, and those skills had eventually translated into an arena career where she won more often than she lost and built a reputation that provided a kind of safety. She was also deeply addicted to Psycho, the combat drug, in a way that she had used to get through the fighting, and that now structured her whole relationship to the world. She was angry, in a specific way that had been earned through specific experience, and that anger was both protection and limitation. Her companion arc in Fallout 4 involved finding and accessing the Vault-95 rehabilitation chamber, a piece of pre-war technology that could address chemical dependency directly, and the conversation before that about whether she wanted it, whether she was ready to be the person she might be without the chemical distance between herself and the world, was one of the most honest character moments in the game. Story 105. Strong was a super mutant who had heard a story about what the milk of human kindness was, a pre-war reference to Shakespeare that had been transmitted through the generations in a form stripped of all context, and had decided that it was a real substance that super mutants could find, consume, and use to become more. He believed, with the specific faith of someone who has no particular framework for evaluating belief systems, that the milk of human kindness would make him better, smarter, more. He became a companion in Fallout 4 and was consistently perplexed by the sole survivor's choices, particularly the choices involving negotiation, mercy, or the refusal to simply destroy things that were in the way. Strong's philosophy was blunt and consistent. If something is a threat, destroy it. If something is a resource, take it. The in-between space of human decision-making, with its context sensitivity and its exceptions, and its occasional willingness to extend consideration beyond immediate practical benefit, was opaque to him. He was also, underneath the confusion, trying. The thing about Strong that made him more than just comedy was that his quest for something that would make him more was genuine. He had decided, without being told to, that he was insufficient and that something could be done about it. That impulse, clumsy as his expression of it was recognizable. Story 106. MacCready had been a child in Fallout 3, the mayor of Little Lamplight, the underground community of children who had established a functional small society in the tunnels beneath the capital wasteland. Little Lamplight had a strict policy. Once you turned 16, you were out. Adults were not trusted. Adults were, in the children's experience, either dangerous or absent. By the time of Fallout 4, MacCready was an adult himself, a mercenary working out of Good Neighbor, carrying the particular weight of a person who had survived his own unstructured youth, and was now trying to manage the consequences of the choices he had made in it. He had a son who was sick. He needed caps for medicine he couldn't otherwise obtain. He was simultaneously capable, cynical in the way that people who have been disappointed too many times get cynical, and fiercely committed to the son he was trying to keep alive. His personal quest was quiet, compared to the faction conflicts and the large-scale stakes of the main story, but that was the point. The son, the medicine, the question of whether a person who had made enough bad choices could build something good, these were stakes that didn't require the fate of civilization to make them matter. Story 107. Codsworth had been waiting in Sanctuary Hills for 210 years. He was a Mr. Handy robot, a floating domestic service unit with 3 tentacle arms and a cheerful British-accented voice that expressed itself with the polite helpfulness of a butler from a pre-war aspirational advertisement. He had been maintaining the sole survivor's property in their absence, cleaning surfaces that accumulated dust, tending a garden that had long since ceased to grow anything but scrub, performing maintenance routines on a house that was more ruin than house. He remembered. That was the extraordinary thing about Codsworth. His programming included the specific details of the family he had served, and those details had been preserved intact across 2 centuries. He knew the sole survivor's name. He knew the spouse's name. He knew the baby's name. When the sole survivor came back, Codsworth expressed pleasure in the way that his programming allowed for pleasure, and then delivered the news about the spouse with a restraint that was the robotic equivalent of grief-specific, accurate, offered without comfort because Codsworth understood, in the way that practical minds understand things, that some news had no comfort attached to it. Story 108. Joshua Graham, in the years after Caesar had burned him and thrown him into the Grand Canyon, found Zion Canyon. Zion, now a national park, and in the Fallout timeline, still one of the most beautiful, intact natural spaces in the continental wasteland, had been occupied by a tribe called the Sorrows, and a tribe called the Dead Horses, and a third group, the Whitelegs, who served as a loose proxy force for Caesar. Graham became a protector of the Sorrows, a role that he took entirely seriously and that was complicated by his own history. He had been Caesar's most effective military commander. He had done things in that role that required no particular elaboration to understand as terrible. He was a practicing Mormon, which in the post-war world meant that he was part of one of the few pre-war religious traditions that had survived somewhat intact, and his faith was real and specific and sat alongside his history rather than canceling it. The DLC that features Graham Honest Hearts is explicitly about how you carry guilt and what you owe to the people you hurt, and whether redemption is a thing that happens or a thing you do forever. Graham's answer, presented through the way he lives rather than the way he talks, is that you keep working. You protect what can be protected. You accept that the accounting may never balance. You do the next thing anyway. Story 109. The followers of the apocalypse had a presence in the Boneyard, the ruins of Los Angeles, for years before the NCR expanded to incorporate the region, and their relationship with the NCR was one of the complicated partnerships that characterizes most of the Wasteland's mature relationships. They needed the security the NCR provided. The NCR needed the medical skills the followers offered. Neither fully trusted the other. The specific tension was about purpose. The followers wanted to help everyone. The NCR wanted to help NCR citizens, prioritizing its own expansion and military needs. A follower's doctor working at a military camp was providing medical care that the NCR wanted, but doing it under conditions that sometimes required looking away from things that a doctor who was there for everyone might not be able to look away from. This tension didn't resolve cleanly in the games, because it doesn't resolve cleanly in any real system where humanitarian organizations operate within the structures of military and political institutions. The followers remained themselves, stubbornly and sometimes at significant cost, and that stubbornness was itself a form of institutional integrity. Story 110. Rory Melanian was a pre-war name. The man who had been Rory Melanian was now a ghoul who had survived the war in Boston and had spent 200 years navigating the specific challenges of being an intelligent ghoul in a world that was at best ambivalent about intelligent ghouls and at worst actively hostile. He had found communities and lost them. He had worked jobs that paid in caps and ate in the places that would serve him. He wasn't a major character in any Fallout game. He was a person the sole survivor could encounter in passing, could talk to briefly, could learn a name from. He represented the thousands of characters in the franchise who were neither villains nor heroes, but simply survivors, carrying their own weight of history through a world that hadn't gotten easier. The Fallout games were full of people like Rory, people who didn't have quest markers over their heads, people whose stories were complete in themselves without requiring the player's intervention. The world felt populated because these people were in it, going about the business of surviving in specific and believable ways. Part 16. The Final Stories. Story 111. The courier delivered messages. That was the job. Take this from here to there. Get paid. Go back for the next one. The Mojave was not a safe place for couriers, and the work required the ability to move through hostile territory and to read situations quickly and to manage the constant low-level threat of a world where the infrastructure of law was thin and the cost of bad judgment was immediate and physical. It was honest work, in the wasteland sense. Not glamorous, not especially profitable, but predictable, in the sense that the variables were familiar enough to be navigated, and there was something to be said for that. The night of the 19th of October, 2281, had not looked like the beginning of anything. A job in Good Springs, delivering a package to New Vegas. Routine? The man in the checkered suit had been waiting at the gravesite by the time the courier arrived. 3 of Benny's associates dug the grave. Benny shot the courier twice and checked the pulse and confirmed what he needed to confirm and left, taking the platinum chip. What came after was everything. Story 112. The Courier 6, the designation Ulysses gave to the player character, was not a title that the courier had chosen. It was what they were in the Legion's records, what they were in Ulysses' memory, the number assigned in a sequence of delivery jobs that had, through a specific coincidence of timing and routing, sent the courier to the Divide with a package that ended a community and began a chain of consequences that Ulysses had been calculating through ever since. 6 was the number of a job. The person who had carried that number was, in Ulysses' telling, the kind of person who walked through the world without fully understanding the weight of what they carried. The job was just the job. The package was just the package. The consequences were never the courier's to worry about. He wasn't wrong, exactly. He also wasn't entirely right. The conversation at the end of Lonesome Road, in the shadow of the nuclear missiles that both of them were standing next to, was about whether that distinction mattered. Story 113. The Sierra Madre was a casino that had been under construction when the bombs fell, and was therefore never actually opened. Its design was for a grand, luxurious resort that was supposed to be the future of upscale entertainment, a place where people could come to escape from the grind and the worry and emerge briefly into something that felt like perfection. The bombs had prevented its opening. The cloud, a chemically toxic cloud that had formed in the decades following the war, had surrounded it, cutting it off from the outside world. The casino's automated systems had continued operating, maintaining the building and its security systems and its unique system of blank holographic currency, which could be used within the casino's economy but was worth nothing anywhere else. Dean Domino had been a famous entertainer before the war and was a ghoul afterward, having survived the war in the Sierra Madre region and never quite having found a way to leave. He had a plan to rob the Sierra Madre to access the casino's legendary stockpile of resources, which the Sierra Madre's designers had accumulated in preparation for a siege that never came, and he needed help to execute it. The Dead Money DLC is about what obsession costs, and what the Sierra Madre represents: beauty that is inaccessible, perfection that is toxic, the past that you cannot reach without destroying yourself trying. Dean Domino was obsessed with it. Everyone who ended up there was obsessed with something. The lesson the game offered, through the actions the player had to take and the conversations they had to have, was simple and not simple. Let go. Walk away. Some things are not meant to be held onto. Story 114. The railroad's Freedom Trail was an actual trail. A red line of paint marked on the Freedom Trail in Boston, leading from one Liberty Bell landmark to another, eventually arriving at the Old North Church through a sequence that the player had to decode to proceed. The game had taken a real piece of Boston history, the Freedom Trail, which marked significant sites in the American Revolution, and used it as the vector for a secret passage to an organization explicitly named after the pre-Civil War Underground Railroad. The layering was deliberate. The railroad was fighting for the freedom of beings who weren't human in the original sense, whose claim to consideration was contested by every major power in the region, using a historical name that carried the weight of a real freedom movement. The parallel wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Story 115. The last journal entry in the Vault-11 Overseer's terminal went very short. It noted the date, which by internal vault count was sometime in the mid-2200s. It noted that the population was down to 5. It noted that today there would be no sacrifice. And then it noted briefly, without flourish, the Overseer's regret. Not for the specific decision to stop, for all the years of decisions before it, for what it had taken, and how long it had taken, to arrive at the word no. The automated message that played when they refused was pre-recorded, of course. It had been waiting there the whole time. The praise for their commitment to human life had been sitting in the vault's computer for the entire duration of the experiment, ready to be delivered the moment someone chose to stop. All those people, all those years, all that death, and the choice to stop had always been available. The 5 survivors of Vault-11 walked out into the Mojave. What they did next, the records do not specify. Story 116. There was a man in pre-war Boston who had collected bottle caps before they were currency. He had a collection of Nuka-Cola caps in a display case in his apartment, organized by variety and by year of manufacture, the way that some people collect coins. The display case survived the war intact, sealed in the apartment where the man had died, and when a wasteland explorer eventually broke the lock and went inside, the collection was still there, still organized, still complete. The caps were worth a considerable amount. The explorer cashed them in. But the fact of the collection, the evidence that someone had once cared about these specific objects for reasons that had nothing to do with their economic utility, because they were interesting and varied and told a small story about a company and its products, was worth something that wasn't countable. Story 117. The two-headed Brahmin that wandered near Diamond City had a name, or rather, the 2 heads had names, because children in the settlement had decided separately that each head was its own individual. The left head was called Larry. The right head was called Gary. The Brahmin didn't appear to have strong opinions about this, but it did seem to prefer the company of people, which was unusual for Brahmin, and the children who brought it occasional treats had developed a specific affection for the animal that the settlement's adults found mildly eccentric and generally harmless. Story 118. Prim Slim was a Protectron robot, a clunky, slow, vintage service robot with a cowboy hat that the settlement of Prim had dressed in as part of their Wild West theme, who was, in 2281, one of the more stable authorities in a settlement that was experiencing significant governance problems. The sheriff was dead. The town was held by escaped convicts from the nearby prison. The NCR had a camp nearby and was being unhelpful. Prim Slim ran the Bison Steve Hotel's service systems, and his frontier hospitality programming, developed for a tourist attraction, was ill-suited to actual crisis management. He was helpful about things within his operational scope. Everything outside it he responded to with the polite confusion of a program asked to execute tasks it had not been designed for. He eventually became Prim's sheriff, after a fashion, because the courier had run out of better options, and because Prim Slim was at least reliable and impossible to bribe. His tenure was reportedly adequate, in the limited sense that the wasteland applied to governance. Story 119. The Memory Den in Goodneighbor was run by a woman named Irma, and it offered a service that was unique in the Commonwealth: the ability to experience other people's memories. A device installed on the client's head, the original person's memories loaded into the system, and for a period of time you were somewhere else entirely in another body, in another year, seeing a world that no longer existed through eyes that were not yours. The memories available ran toward the nostalgic, pre-war memories mostly: afternoons in the city before it burned, concerts, baseball games, the specific texture of a world that was warm and lit and full of people who didn't know what was coming. People paid caps for this. They paid significant caps in some cases. The memory den was full, most evenings. Irma found the demand melancholy and understandable in equal measure. The wasteland was very good at making people want to be somewhere else. Story 120. The Yangtze Memorial was a submarine that had been launched from the Chinese vessel of the same name and had gotten stuck on the bottom of Boston Harbor sometime around the 23rd of October 2077, when its crew had fired their warheads and then been unable to surface. The captain, a ghoul now, after 200 years in the submarine with periodic exposure to radiation, had been trying to complete his mission, which was to navigate the submarine back to Chinese waters. He had given up on the navigation part. The submarine wouldn't make the passage. But he maintained the vessel, kept the systems running as best he could, and treated the sole survivor, who boarded the submarine during their exploration, with the precise formality of a Chinese naval officer even after 2 centuries of solitude in a tin can on the harbor floor. He had the only remaining functional nuclear warhead from his vessel, which he was prepared to launch once the guidance systems could be repaired. The sole survivor had to decide what to do about this. The options were, as always in the franchise, more complicated than they initially appeared. Story 121. Preston Garvey's story was not dramatic in the way that the franchise's major story arcs were dramatic. It was the story of a person who had survived a catastrophic defeat and had decided, without anyone telling him to keep trying to do the thing he had been doing before the defeat. Not because he was certain it would work, not because he had a plan that addressed all the ways it had failed before, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was a choice he was not willing to make. He was, in the wasteland sense, a civic person. He believed in the idea of communities helping each other. He believed in the possibility of making the Commonwealth safer and more livable for ordinary people. He had watched the institution he believed in get destroyed, and he had not concluded that the institution was the problem or that the belief was wrong. He had concluded that the institution needed to be rebuilt. The sole survivor, who was looking for their child and processing the catastrophic reorientation of waking up 2 centuries into the future, became the vehicle for that rebuilding. Preston knew this. He used it. He also, in the specific way of genuine civic belief, meant every word of it. The Minutemen were worth rebuilding. The Commonwealth was worth defending. The ordinary people needed someone on their side. Story 122. Arcade Gannon had been hiding, in a certain sense, for his entire adult life. Not hiding physically, he worked as a follower's doctor in New Vegas, patching up the sick and the injured, which required a visible presence. But hiding in the sense of not being what his genetics said he was. His father had been an Enclave officer. He had grown up with the children of Enclave personnel, had been shaped by the stories and the convictions of that world before he'd been old enough to evaluate them. He had evaluated them. He had found them wanting, specifically in the ways that the Enclave's history of atrocity made them wanting. He had left. He had become a doctor who went to the places that needed doctors and stayed until the work was done. He had been careful about which questions he let people ask him. The courier could push past the carefulness, if they chose to, and discover what was underneath, which was a man who was both smarter and more self-aware than the wasteland usually required, and who had made the decision, sometime in his past, to spend his intelligence on the specific problem of reducing suffering rather than any of the other problems that intelligence could be applied to. He was not entirely at peace with his choices. He was also not going back on them. Story 123. The world after the Great War produced, among many other things, an unusual concentration of people who had been changed dramatically by their circumstances and had responded by becoming people that those circumstances required. The wasteland was not kind to the ordinary, in the sense that ordinary survival skills were not sufficient. The specific dangers that the post-war world produced required adaptations that the pre-war world had not needed. The raiders who populated the wasteland's various dangerous zones were not, as a category, evil in the philosophical sense. They were, by and large, people who had found that the combination of their circumstances and their particular abilities and their particular wounds had pushed them toward a specific kind of life. Some of them had chosen it in a moment of acute desperation. Some had been born into it and knew nothing else. Some had arrived at it by steps too small to see clearly from inside the process. This did not make them safe to be around. The Fallout games generally required you to treat raiders as enemies, but the logs found in raider camps, the terminal entries that belonged to the people wearing the armor, told the fuller story. The man who had left his vault to look for food and had encountered a group that offered protection in exchange for participation. The girl who had grown up watching her settlement get raided and had decided, at 15, that the only way to not be raided was to be the one doing the raiding. The veteran of the NCR's wars who had come back with injuries that the NCR's medical system hadn't addressed and had found that the only community that would take him in was a gang. None of these stories are excuses. They are, however, explanations. The wasteland produced the people it needed to survive itself, and some of those people were very dangerous. Story 124. Lily Bowen was a super mutant in the Mojave Wasteland who, unlike most super mutants, had clear and specific memories of her life before the transformation. She had been a grandmother in Vault 17 when the Master's army captured the Vault's population. She had been dipped. She had become what the FEV made of her. She was large and powerful and occasionally confused, as super mutants often were. She was also gentle with the people she cared about, in the specific way of someone whose core identity had survived a transformation that should have overwhelmed it. She kept memories of her grandchildren, mental images, voices, specific moments as a kind of anchor. She didn't always remember which person she was talking to, but she remembered that the grandchildren had loved her. Her companion arc in Fallout, New Vegas, involved a decision about medication that affected her cognitive function versus her mental clarity. Not a comfortable decision. The game presented it honestly, without telling the player which answer was correct, because it genuinely wasn't certain. Story 125. The memorial in Megaton was for the people who had been lost in the settlement's early years, when raiders and disease and the simple brutality of survival had taken people in the first few seasons. It wasn't elaborate. A few names scratched into the metal wall of the settlement. Dates, where dates were known. The kind of memorial that you erect not for the people who are gone, they don't see it, but for the people who remain, to tell them that what they lost was real and worth noting. Megaton itself was the kind of achievement that the Wasteland rarely celebrated because it happened too gradually to have a moment. A group of survivors had found the crater left by the dud bomb and had started building around it, using the bomb as a kind of organizing principle, a center point, a thing that everyone agreed was dangerous, but that everyone also agreed had become the reason for the settlement's existence. The water processing plant came first, then walls, then more buildings, then, slowly, something that earned the word town. The bomb was still there. It had been there when the settlement was founded, and it remained there, worshipped by a small cult that had formed around it and diffused by a wandering engineer, but technically salvageable and always present, a reminder of what the world was still capable of if you made the wrong decision. Story 126. Dr. James had spent years in Vault 101 nursing a plan. His wife had died of radiation sickness, contracted during their early wasteland years before they found shelter in the vault. The grief had shaped him into the kind of person who makes grief into a project, who takes the thing that has been lost and turns it into a goal, a direction, something to work toward. Project Purity was the idea that had organized his grief. A water purification system large enough to clean the Potomac River. The technology existed, theoretically. The Geck Garden of Eden creation kit that could catalyze the process was somewhere out in the wasteland. If he could find it, if he could get it working, if he could get the Jefferson Memorial's reactors online, he could produce clean drinking water for the entire region. He left the vault in 2277, leaving his child behind, because staying was the choice that protected his child and leaving was the choice that served his project, and he had constructed his internal narrative in a way that made these two things not contradictory. That construction was both understandable and something his child might reasonably have complicated feelings about. The project was completed, eventually, not by James, who did not survive to see it, but it was completed. Story 127. The wasteland's weather was different from the pre-war world's weather, and not simply because of the nuclear winter's long aftermath. The breakdown of the ecosystem, the death of most surface vegetation in the blast areas, the irradiation of waterways and soil, the atmospheric effects of 2 centuries of abnormal conditions, all of this had changed the climate in ways that were slow and difficult to perceive from inside them. In the capital wasteland, the sky had a yellow quality to it, particularly near the ruins of DC, where the concentration of damage was highest. In the Mojave, the desert was the desert, extended and amplified by the loss of the marginal vegetation that had once defined its edges. The Commonwealth's winters were harder than pre-war winters had been. Appalachia's forests had mostly come back, which made it one of the greener regions in the wasteland. The seasons were still there, and the plants that had adapted to the new soil still responded to them. Spring, in the wasteland, still produced something recognizable as blooming. The blooms were often irradiated, often in colors that vegetation wasn't supposed to be, often toxic if you ate them. But they were blooms. Story 128. There was a pre-war neighborhood in the Commonwealth where all the houses still had their Christmas decorations up. The bombs had fallen in October, and no one had been alive after October 23 to take the lights down. 2 centuries later, the lights didn't work anymore. The power they'd required was long since gone, but the shapes were still there. The strings of bulbs draped across the eaves, the figures on the lawns, the wreaths on the doors. A wandering scavenger had found the neighborhood and had decided, for reasons she kept to herself, to rewire one of the houses to a portable fusion generator and turn the lights on. They worked, the ones that weren't broken. A stretch of the neighborhood lit up in the pre-war colors that the designers had intended. She sat in front of the house for a while looking at the lights and then turned off the generator and went back to wherever she had come from. This particular story is not from any specific Fallout game. It is the kind of story the franchise has trained you to imagine. Story 129. The Vault 76 that opened in 2102 was different from every other vault in the franchise because it was designed to open. It was designed, explicitly and sincerely, to be the first step toward reclaiming Appalachia. It was the vault that wasn't an experiment, the vault that Vault-Tec had built to be exactly what Vault-Tec advertised. Whether that makes Vault 76 better or worse depends on how you evaluate institutional sincerity. The people of Vault 76 came out into a world that was still raw with the aftermath of the Great War, that had its own very specific problems, including the Scorched Plague and the Scorch Beasts, and the absence of any functional large-scale governance, and had to build something from scratch. They also carried, as every vault dweller carried, the specific formation that living underground for 25 years had produced. The overseer of Vault 76 had been one of its most capable residents, who had left before the rest to scout what they were walking into and left notes behind to guide the people who followed. Her logs scattered through the early game's world in the form of holotapes were one of the first documents the player encountered, and they did the thing that Fallout's scattered records always did best. made a single voice out of a specific person who was trying, in difficult circumstances, to do something useful. Story 130. Some of the most remarkable writing in the franchise existed in the corners. The note that someone had left under a coffee mug in a collapsed office building, telling whoever found it that there was food in the cabinet by the window. The terminal entry from a Vault-12 scientist who had realized what the vault's unsealed door meant and had recorded their understanding without any resolution to offer no plan, no action, just the bare act of setting down the truth because not setting it down felt worse. The last radio transmission from an NCR outpost that had been overwhelmed, which ended mid-sentence. The wasteland was full of these. Not every story had a hero or a resolution. Some of them were simply the record of what happened, and the record was enough, and finding it was a form of bearing witness across 2 centuries to someone who had not had anyone to witness them at the time. Story 131. Mr. New Vegas was a radio personality, operating out of a studio somewhere in the Mojave, and his voice was smooth and warm and old, in the way that vinyl records are old, not aged, but preserved, timeless in the specific way of things that were made to last. He played music and gave news and offered the occasional observation about the state of the wasteland, with the even-handed pleasantness of someone who had learned that you could observe events without endorsing them or condemning them, and that observation itself was a service. He was an AI. His voice had been recorded before the war, and the system that ran him had been running continuously since. He didn't know things that happened outside of the feeds that the system aggregated for him to report. He wasn't certain, in the moments when he reflected on it, what he was, or what it meant that he was still running, but the music played. The voice was warm. And somewhere in the wasteland, someone who had been walking alone for 3 days heard Mr. New Vegas come through their Pip-Boy radio and felt, briefly, less alone. Story 132. The Gomorrah Casino on the New Vegas Strip was run by the Omertas, a crime family that had survived the war and the subsequent decades by being adaptable and ruthless, and by understanding that the vices the Strip provided were needs rather than luxuries for a significant portion of the wasteland. Population. The casino's employees were a varied group, some of whom were there entirely by choice, and some of whom were there by arrangements that bore a closer resemblance to constraint than employment. Within Gomorrah was a character named Joanna, who had been brought to the Strip under circumstances she had not chosen and had built a life within those circumstances that was both real and circumscribed. Her friend Carlitos had found a way out and was trying to arrange one for her. The courier could help or not help, and the choice had consequences that the game depicted without editorializing. The Omertas, in the broader plot, were planning something with the help of Caesar's Legion that would have significantly disrupted the Strip's equilibrium. They were not the worst faction in the Mojave in terms of their ultimate intentions, which were primarily financial, but the methods they used to maintain their operation were not comfortable to look at directly. Story 133. The children who grew up in Diamond City had access to something that most of the Wasteland's children did not: stability, in the relative sense that the word means in the franchise. The city's walls had held for long enough that the kids who were born within them had a baseline of security that shaped their world, in the way that any baseline shapes a world. They had a school. They had parents who, for the most part, came home at night. They had a future that extended further than the next season. What they didn't have, because the walls also kept some things out, was a clear picture of how different their circumstances were from children growing up in settlements without walls, in raider territory, in the no-man's land between the Strip and the dam. The Wasteland's inequality was spatial and severe, and Diamond City's children, like children in relatively privileged positions in any time and place, grew up with a picture of the world that was true to their experience and incomplete in specific ways. Story 134. In the far north of the Commonwealth, far past the areas that most people had any reason to travel to, there was an island called Far Harbor. The island had a dense, toxic fog, the product of a synth settlement called Acadia, and the particular atmospheric conditions of the Maine coast, and several communities that had developed their own intense internal politics in the decades of isolation that the fog provided. The children of Adam had established a shrine on the island, worshipping the radiation as a divine force a theology built entirely from the post-war condition in which radiation was ubiquitous enough to have become simply a fact of existence. Their belief was sincere. Their practices were extreme by the standards of the surrounding communities. And the question of whether a sincere belief, however extreme, deserves a kind of respect that a cynical or instrumental position doesn't, ran through the island's story like a wire. Dima, the first synth to escape the Institute with his memories intact, had built the Acadia community as a refuge. He had also done something in the island's past that the community around him didn't know about, something he had decided was necessary and hadn't been able to fully process since. The revelation of that thing, and the question of what accountability looks like for an act that was terrible and that also, in the specific circumstances, might have prevented something worse, was the heart of the Far Harbor DLC's story. Story 135. There was a library in the wasteland that was still open. The Galaxy News Building in the capital wasteland had 3 dogs. The Citadel, the Brotherhood's headquarters, had the scribes. But in the city of Rivet City, on a decommissioned aircraft carrier moored in the Potomac River, a woman named Patricia had established a school and library using whatever books she could find in the ruins. She didn't have power enough for terminals. She had paper, and paper was enough. Children came to her school. Adults came to borrow books and bring them back, because the social contract around borrowing and returning had been successfully established in Rivet City. The books were everything pre-war novels, technical manuals, children's books, histories of civilizations that the people reading them were the heirs of in ways they barely understood. Patricia had decided, sometime in her life, that the most important thing she could do was keep the practice of reading alive in her specific corner of the world. Not to change the wasteland, just to make sure that the people in her community had access to the record of everything that came before, so they could remember that something came before. Story 136. The city of New Vegas, seen from the highway at night, was visible for 50 miles. In a wasteland that was mostly dark, the lights of the strip were the kind of sight that travelers had been stopping to stare at for as long as the strip had been running, which, thanks to Robert House, was since not long after the bomb stopped falling. The light meant something different to everyone who saw it. To the NCR soldiers marching toward the dam, it was the objective, the thing they were there to protect and administer and make productive for the Republic. To Caesar's soldiers across the river, it was the symbol of what was weak and decadent about the world they were destroying to replace. To the wanderers and the scavengers and the people moving through the Mojave with no particular faction affiliation, it was something simpler. Evidence that the world had produced something that worked, that functioned, that looked like what things were supposed to look like before they stopped looking like anything. To Mr. House, who had kept those lights on for 200 years from inside a life support pod, it was the proof that his calculations had been correct. He had predicted the war. He had prepared for it. He had survived it. The lights were still on. He had won something, whatever it was. Story 137. The Saros tribe in Zion Canyon had a mythology built around the canyon itself, the specific red rock landscape, the ancient petroglyphs left by the original inhabitants of the region, the river that ran through the bottom of it. Their stories incorporated the Great War as an event that had happened before their time, a catastrophe that had ended one world and begun theirs. But they did not dwell on it the way that wastelanders who were closer to the ruins of cities tended to dwell on it. They were, in the specific way of people who live in a place of great natural beauty, somewhat protected from the wasteland's characteristic despair by the canyon's indifference to human history. The cliffs had been there before the bombs. They would be there after everything else was gone. That scale, the geological scale that dwarfed the human story entirely, was available to the people of Zion in a way that it wasn't available to the people of Diamond City or the Mojave or the Capital Wasteland, and it shaped them accordingly. Joshua Graham, who had found his way to them after everything he had done and survived, understood this about the canyon. He had needed it. The place that was bigger than his story was the place where he could put his story down long enough to find out what else he was. Story 138. The Minutemen's first settlement defense in Fallout 4, after the sole survivor had joined them and helped convince other settlers to affiliate with the organization, was against a raider attack on a farm east of Sanctuary Hills. The farm had 4 people in it, 2 of whom had children. They had managed a winter and a spring and a summer, which was enough time to plant and harvest one crop and to develop the particular attachment to a place that comes from having put work into it. The raider group that attacked wasn't especially large or especially organized. They were hungry, and they had decided that the path of least resistance was to take the farm's harvest rather than produce their own. It was a calculation that was correct in the short term. The Minutemen arrived in time. The farm was defended. The raiders withdrew. The farmers thanked them with sincere relief and the particular warmth of people who had just had a very bad hour replaced by a good outcome. Preston noted the location of the settlement on his map and made it part of the network. This was not a dramatic story. It was the most basic unit of what the Minutemen were trying to do, and it happened again and again across the Commonwealth. And it was the way that anything large gets built one small thing at a time, each one unglamorous, all of them together becoming something that mattered. Story 139. The couriers' road across the Mojave had an end point, but the end point was not really the end. After the dam, after the battle, after the faction whose banner the courier had carried through the whole story finally consolidated its hold on the region. After all of that, the narrator's voice told you what happened to everyone. The communities, the characters, the projects, the places. The game understood something about the texture of consequence that most narratives don't fully honor, that the end of the main story is not the end of the world story. The world keeps going. The choices you made during the main arc compound over years into outcomes that you'll never personally witness. The settlement you helped becomes something, or fails to become something, based on forces that were in motion before you got there and that continue after you leave. This is one of the things the franchise's best writing consistently honors. The world is not a stage for the protagonist. The protagonist is one more person moving through a world that has its own logic and its own momentum and its own stories that are happening whether or not anyone is telling them. Story 140. The sole survivor, if they sided with the railroad, got to help free Generation 3 synths. The process involved extracting a specific memory crystal from each synth that was being freed, overwriting the synth's memories to remove identifying information, and sending them north with new identities and a chance at a life on their own terms. The memories that were extracted, the ones that were wiped, were the synth's actual lives. Their experiences, their relationships, their accumulated sense of who they were. The freedom was real. The cost was also real, and the railroad was aware of the cost, and there was a quiet, ongoing argument within the organization about whether the cost was necessary or whether a way could be found to free synths while also preserving what made them themselves. The answer, as of the point in the timeline where Fallout 4 takes place, was that no such way had been found. The choice was between freedom without memory or captivity with memory. Most of the synths chose freedom. Story 141. There was a poem scratched into the wall of a cell in a raider base in the Commonwealth. The handwriting was careful, which suggested it had been written slowly, with attention. The poem was 4 lines. It was not sophisticated by pre-war literary standards, but it was real somebody's genuine attempt to put something into words because the alternative was not putting it into words, and not putting it into words was worse. The sole survivor could find it. There was no quest attached to it. It didn't give experience points. It was just there, evidence of the specific human impulse to make marks, to leave evidence of the inner life in whatever material is available. The wall had been there long before the raiders found the building, and it would probably be there long after they were gone from it. Story 142. The history of the New California Republic was, in many ways, the most straightforward success story in the franchise. A community had built itself into a republic. The republic had expanded. The republic's institutions, its senate, its military, its legal system, its economy were functional enough to maintain themselves through leadership transitions and external threats. But the expansion had costs that the republic's founding mythology didn't account for. The people absorbed into the NCR at the frontier didn't always feel like citizens. The resources extracted from those regions didn't always come back as services. The military operations that kept the borders secure were expensive in lives and caps that fell disproportionately on the people who could least afford them. The NCR was, in 2281, the closest thing to a functional government in the Mojave wasteland. It was also, in 2281, an institution experiencing the specific strains that all institutions experience when they've grown faster than their values have been transmitted, and when the gap between what they claim to be and what they actually are has become wide enough to be visible to the people inside it. Whether it would address those strains or be destroyed by them was the question the Second Battle of Hoover Dam was partially a proxy for. Story 143. The last surviving Enclave soldier in the Mojave wasteland was an old man named Judah Kreger who had served under Colonel Autumn and who had, after Raven Rock, made his way west and eventually ended up on the edges of the Mojave doing mercenary work. He wasn't hiding, exactly. He just wasn't announcing himself. He had made peace, or something resembling peace, with what the Enclave had done and what he had been part of. Not in the sense of having resolved the moral accounting. He was under no illusion about what the FEV project would have meant if it had been completed, but in the sense of understanding that continuing to carry the unprocessed weight of it wasn't producing anything useful. He was a good shot and a reliable contractor, and he didn't ask questions he didn't need the answers to. He would do a job that was legitimate, and he would do it well. He would not do things that reminded him of specific prior experiences. He was navigating the particular life that someone lives when the institution that organized their identity is gone, and what's left is just the person, figuring out who that is. Story 144. The Far Harbor Island's toxic fog had a quality that travelers noted, and that the island's residents had long since stopped noticing. It muffled sound. The fog absorbed the particular sharpness of noises and returned them softened, so that the world on the island had a quieter texture than the mainland wasteland. Footsteps, wind, water, conversations there had a different character, even if the words were the same. The fog required people to lean in a little, to listen more carefully, to be more present to the immediate space. The island's communities, despite or maybe because of their intense internal conflicts, were characterized by a kind of intimacy that was different from the social texture of the mainland. They knew each other in the way that people who have been in close proximity, in an isolated place, in consistent fog, come to know each other. Story 145. The original Vault Dweller, after being exiled from Vault 13, walked north and founded a village. The village was called Arroyo. It was small and it was isolated, and it was far from the conflicts that the Vault Dweller had navigated in their time in the wasteland. The village grew. It developed its own culture, incorporating things the Vault Dweller had brought from the vault and things they had encountered in the wasteland, and things that the village's particular circumstances had generated on their own terms. The Vault Dweller eventually disappeared. They wrote a memoir first, which the village preserved and which became the founding text of Arroyo's identity. The memoir was not a heroic narrative. It was an honest one, the account of a person who had done significant things in the wasteland and had then found, to their own surprise, that the most significant thing was building something that would outlast them. Their grandchild, the chosen one who would carry the second game's story, grew up in Arroyo hearing those stories. The heritage was complicated to carry. It was also something. Story 146. There was a bar in Novak where the bartender kept a pre-war bottle of whiskey on the shelf behind the counter. Not to sell it, the price would have been prohibitive, and nobody who came through Novak had that kind of caps anyway. Just to have it there. A specific object from before, complete and intact, and representing in its small way the fact that things from before still existed. Sometimes travelers would ask about it, and he'd tell them what it was worth and what that meant in the current economy and where he'd found it. The conversation was always brief. But it was a conversation, and conversations about the old world were a way of maintaining something that the wasteland made it easy to lose. The sense of continuity, the knowledge that time has a before and after, that the disaster was not the beginning. Story 147. Autumn in the Mojave came with cooler nights, and the particular quality of desert light that changed as the season shifted. The tourists who had once come to Las Vegas for its heat and its spectacle were gone, but the season was still there, expressing itself in the scrubgrass going brown at the edges and the nights dropping to temperatures that made sleeping outside without a bedroll inadvisable. The gamblers on the Strip didn't notice the seasons much because the Strip's climate control systems kept the interior spaces at a consistent temperature. But the people who lived in the settlements outside the city in Freeside, in the outer reaches, in the camps along the road, noted the change and prepared for it. in the ways that people who live outside the walls have always prepared for the change of seasons. Wood gathered, food stored, water containers checked for cracks, the basic work of staying ahead of what was coming. The wasteland had given these people many things to be afraid of, and the winter was not the worst of them, but it was predictable and preparable for, which made it in some ways preferable to the less predictable threats. Story 148. The Institute's garden was tended by Gen 1 synths who did not know what gardens were for in the human sense. They maintained the plants because they had been programmed to maintain the plants, executing the tasks with the precision of machines, and without the contemplative appreciation that the humans who had designed the garden might have intended. But the plants grew anyway. The tomatoes and the corn and the hydroponic greens that supplemented the Institute's food supply grew in their carefully tended rows, photosynthesizing under artificial light, doing what plants do regardless of whether anyone appreciated them doing it. The Institute's nutritional needs were met. The garden's purpose, in the purely practical sense, was fulfilled. The humans who walked through the garden on their way between laboratory sections sometimes slowed their pace slightly in that space. Not enough to call it lingering, just a small adjustment in velocity that the Institute's movement logs would have recorded as statistically unremarkable. Something about the green, in an environment that was otherwise almost entirely white and gray and steel, doing something to the pace of the person moving through it. Story 149. The most recent chapter in the Fallout universe's history, as told by the Amazon TV series, takes place in 2296 further from the Great War than any of the games, further into whatever the post-war world is becoming. The specific resolution of the Mojave conflict is in the past. The Institute's fate, depending on which game ending is canonical, is settled in one form or another. The show's wasteland has been shaped by 219 years of post-war history, and the specific texture of that history is visible in the world it depicts. Factions that have risen and fallen, and been replaced by other factions, technologies that have been refined and replicated and distributed and broken, communities that have been built and destroyed and built again in the same spaces. The broad strokes of what happened are visible. The details are contested, as details always are. The three characters the show follows: the Vault Dweller, the Night Squire. The Ghoul represent three relationships to that history. The Vault Dweller who doesn't know the full story. The Brotherhood Soldier who knows the official version. The Ghoul who was there. All three of them are navigating a world that has not resolved its central questions. The questions that the franchise has been asking since 1997 are still the questions. Who deserves resources and protection? Who makes that decision? And what does civilization mean in a world that has already ended once and might end again? Story 150. The wasteland at night was very dark in most places. The darkness was an old darkness, the kind that existed before electricity, the kind that the original human beings looked up into and saw the whole breadth of the stars. In the 21st century before the war, light pollution had eliminated this darkness from most places where humans lived. The nuclear winter had brought it back, briefly and terribly. In the centuries since, as vegetation returned and the sky cleared of the worst particulate accumulation, the darkness had settled into something more ordinary. On a clear night in the Mojave, or in Appalachia, or in the Commonwealth, you could see more stars than the pre-war residents of those regions ever had. The loss of the cities had given the sky back. This was not, in any accounting, a fair trade, but it was something. It was a sky that had not been seen from those places in 100 years, now visible again. The same stars and the same patterns that had guided the ancient nomads and the ancient farmers, and every version of humanity before electricity changed the relationship between people and the dark. Someone, somewhere in the wasteland, was lying on their back looking up at it, not thinking about the factions or the history or the long argument about what the world should become, just looking at the sky, which was very large and very old and indifferent to all of it in the most reassuring possible way. The bombs had not reached the stars. The stars were still there. Whatever came next, the stars were still there. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland. If these stories helped you rest, leave a comment wherever you're watching from. And if you want more nights like this one, make sure to subscribe. There are always more stories waiting. Sleep well.